Hey everyone, my name is Jake, and welcome to this 53rd episode of Good Timin. As always on this podcast, we're going to be talking about one of our favorite bands, the Beach Boys. And today we have a very special and meaningful show in store for you all, as we're going to be paying tribute to the late, great Brian Wilson and discussing his life, his legacy, and of course, all of the great music that he left us with. By the time that this episode comes out, it will have been 2 weeks since we found out that we lost Brian. I don't think that the news was completely unexpected, given Brian's age and health. But that said, it still really did catch me off guard, and it took me quite a while to even process it. As I'm sure some of you listening know, the Beach Boys have been a really big part of my life for about the past 5 years or so. And over that time, I've really connected with so many of Brian's songs. Beyond all of the amazing songwriting and production that he did over the years, I've always just really appreciated how honest and vulnerable Brian was. And I think that's a big part of what makes his music so moving and relatable to me. His songs have been there through a lot of good times and bad times in my life these past several years, and I've seen many other people also share how the Beach Boys music really helped them or saved them during a difficult time in their lives. Of course, it's very sad that Brian is no longer with us, but I think that we're all truly blessed to have received so much amazing music from him over the years, as well as getting to see him overcome so many of the challenges and hard times that he faced throughout his life. I think it's just really inspiring to see somebody persevere and succeed when they have a lot of odds stacked against them. And I think that Brian really did just that. So, joining me for tonight's show, I have my good friends Riley, Matt, and Nate, who, like me, have a really deep love and appreciation for Brian's music. Before we get into discussing his life and some of the key moments of his lengthy career, do you guys want to share how Brian has positively impacted your own lives these past several years and what his music has meant to you?
I just want to say, with me, I would just say, I think his music has kind of helped me appreciate music on a deeper level than I did before. Especially like when you deep dive into just how complex some of the arrangements and chords and production was, both for its time, but even like when compared to music today. And I think just how there's a lot of beauty in it, but then also just like how melancholic and heartfelt it can be at times. And yeah, and I just think that also like really getting into this band has like really caused me to form a lot of deeper like relationships in my life, both like friendships and stuff like that that I never really expected to, becoming a fan. And there's just the gifts he gave. It's just, it really did just change my life in ways I never could have expected when I first kind of got into this band mm, about 6 years ago now, right? Yeah, it's about 6 years, 7 years ago. So thanks, Brian, for everything.
I had to look. I wrote something down in my songwriting book the uh, the other day, or the day he passed. I don't really consider myself a very sentimental or emotional person. When I was younger, I certainly was, but as I've gotten older, it's something that I've kind of conditioned myself to pack down. But when Brian died, it was something that kind of hit out of nowhere. I really couldn't imagine where I'd be without the Beach Boys music and especially his songs right now. I remember I first fell in love when I heard I Get Around on Regular Show. And it was probably the first song where music, maybe besides the Beatles a little bit, really made me feel something besides just happy or sad. It made me feel nostalgic. It made me kind of feel happy to be like young and just around. And then in college, I really got into his music. It really made me rethink just where I was as a musician. At that point in time, I wanted to be Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, and just play guitar and call it a day. But then it actually made me want to write songs. While Paul Weller and the Jam made me want to write songs about punk, it was Brian who made me learn the chords that I was actually playing. Um, I don't know. I just really like his music, and it's something that makes me feel different compared to a lot of other music. It made me rethink the way I listen, made me rethink the way that I play, and I couldn't imagine where I'd be today without his music.
Yeah, that was a really beautiful sentiment from both of you guys, and it's hard to put into words what Brian meant to me. And I know he meant a lot to everyone, so I'm not trying to make it sound like what he meant to me is greater than anyone else, but personally, no single musician or artist has single-handedly had such an impact on my life. And that's not only through the enjoyment I get from listening to his songs and the model of excellence that I try to copy as far as his production and arranging goes. But what really made Brian such an impact on me is he was perhaps the first producer I discovered, or songwriter producer that I discovered, that I saw similarities when I looked at him to the social challenges we both went through. Most artists have a real larger than life persona, and they seem like gods and goddesses. But Brian always seemed like a real person with real challenges and real struggles. And I really related to that. And seeing the way that he always overcame what was in his way gave me the confidence to try to pursue music as well, whatever challenges came my way. And for that, I will always be eternally grateful for him. So it's a pleasure to be talking about him with you boys tonight.
All right, so for tonight's episode, we're kind of going to do what we've done on previous like member spotlight episodes that we've done, where we've kind of go through the Beach Boys members' career and things that occurred in their life. So Nate, do you kind of want to start us off kind of with Brian's formative years and his early years growing up in California?
Yeah, so, as we all know, Brian was born in 1942 on June 20th. And, in many ways, he had what could be considered the sort of quintessential all-American childhood. He had two brothers, Carl and Dennis, and they shared a bedroom. And Brian loved sports. He played baseball, he played football, ran track. He was a real athletic kid. And, I think in many ways, Brian was your all-American young kid, but there was one thing that really set him apart from his peers, and that was his deep passion for music. And his bandmate and cousin, Mike Love, said that his earliest memory of his cousin Brian was hearing Brian singing Danny Boy on his grandma's lap. And from that age onwards, Mike and Brian would sing together and with Brian's other brothers and with Mike's sister, and it was a family affair. They would sing at Christmas parties and family get-togethers. They'd go Christmas caroling. So for a long time, music was a part of Brian's life, not only through singing with his brothers and cousins, but also because both of his parents were musicians as well. His mom was a skilled keyboard player, and his dad was a songwriter. And, to talk about Brian's childhood, we have to address the fact that things weren't always, you know, easy for him. Uh, Brian dealt with a fair amount of social anxiety and probably some undiagnosed mental challenges where, maybe if he was growing up today, those things would be noticed and diagnosed, but it was a different era back then. And not only that, but on top of that, you had a very strained relationship with his father, who at times could be extremely abusive, both verbally and physically. But despite all of that, around his teenage years, Brian started taking the idea of playing music more seriously beyond just being a hobby. And at this time, he was getting into the Four Freshmen and their really far out modern harmonies. He was getting into rock and roll like Chuck Berry and Jane and Dean. And slowly but surely, Brian, along with his brothers and his cousin and his friends, start to take the idea seriously of having a group. And that brings us to the very earliest days of the Beach Boys, or as they were then known, the Pendletons. And they would do a cappella covers. And when it came time to go to the recording studio for the first time, the producer, Height Morgan, thought they were good singers, thought they were, onto something, but he wanted something original. And that's when Brian and Mike wrote Surfin'. And that was the first original those guys wrote together. And thus began the amazing saga of the Beach Boys. And so I think that brings us to a good point to start to discuss their earliest days as a group.
Yeah, a couple things I wanted to mention to kind of add on to what Nate said is that, Brian, obviously a huge influence of his, like Nate mentioned, was the Four Freshmen. And I remember reading that growing up, he would like almost like deconstruct the harmonies from their records and try to like match them on the keyboard, which really kind of shows you kind of like his musical knowledge at that age, and just how deep his interest went in music, that at that young age, like being 12, 13 years old, he was already interested in that kind of thing, isolating each vocal part and trying to figure them out on the keyboard. It's also worth mentioning, too, that Brian's family was a big influence on his musical upbringing as well. I know Carl was really the one who kind of introduced him to R&B and like the Chuck Berry records, which you listen to those early Beach Boys songs and you really kind of hear that in the sound. It's kind of a blend of the Four Freshmen vocal material with kind of the Chuck Berry R&B. And then also Brian's uncle Charlie also taught him boogie woogie piano, which is also a part of the group's early sound. It would also be something that came up, throughout the group's recording history. So those are a couple of things that I wanted to add. Also wanted to mention too that in September of 1960, Brian enrolled as a psychology major in college at El Camino College in LA. But he was disappointed by the teacher's disdain for pop music, which was something he was obviously very interested in. So he ended up dropping out of college after about 18 months. So, Brian was kind of a very individual, person. He wanted to pursue his interests, and he wasn't going to let, somebody else tell him, oh, that's a waste of time. You're never gonna make it big in this area. So he would do what he wanted to do, and that's really what he did. And you can kind of like read that, and there's a couple of documents that he wrote when he was really young, kind of talking about like what he wanted to do with his life, and those are very eye-opening because you can kind of see like how committed and dedicated he was to pursuing his dreams. So
I also
I
wanted
have
to,
two little. Oh, sorry.
oh, you're good. I was just gonna add, Jake, adding to what you were saying about the college thing. I know that in high school, there's a story that like for his senior project in like one of his musical composition classes, Brian turned in like an early version of Surfin' and got an F because the professor was saying like, well, this is not what I asked for. And then I think a couple of years ago, actually, he went back to Hawthorne High and they changed it retroactively to an A. So Brian was definitely someone that, even from a young age was always like marching kind of to the beat of his own drum.
It may have gotten an F, but it made him millionaires.
There's that story with him playing football with Al at the high school, I think. And like he was definitely an athlete, but when it came to football, he was on the B team, which is like basically like JV. And there's that play where I think and it's a very Brian thing to do, I guess, to like he put the ball in the wrong direction, and because he's playing quarterback, like fourth string quarterback, and then he got like decked, or I think he got decked by Al or something, and then like Al like broke his arm, and yeah, and yet
Broke his leg.
but that's when Al discovered him, and then Al kind of noticed that he had that like love for music, and they kind of connected from there. I always thought that story was pretty funny because that's totally something he would do.
oh, go
Yeah, I
ahead.
have two little tidbits that popped into my head as we are discussing these things. One, a fun fact. I assume most of our audience, if you're listening to this, you probably know, but if you don't, it's such a cool little tidbit. Is that on the Beach Boys' first record that we mentioned, "Surfin'," you might assume that Dennis Wilson, their drummer, was playing the drums on that track, but it's actually Brian playing the drums, or really singular drum, snare drum. Sometimes people say it was with his fingers. Sometimes people say it was with a pencil. But either way, first Beach Boys record has Brian Wilson as the drummer. And one other thing I'd like to add that I just think is so beautiful is as a young guy, Brian said that he wanted to either be a psychologist or a baseball player. And what I think is just so beautiful is while he didn't become either of those things, he sold out stadiums like a baseball player, and he helped people with their challenges in life like a therapist did. So even though he didn't directly accomplish those goals, he fulfilled a very similar role in people's lives.
All right, so now Nate, do you want to get into kind of how the Beach Boys officially came together, after being the Pendletones, and then kind of Brian's early production work and some of the collaborators that he worked with in those early years?
Yeah, so the Beach Boys recorded essentially what you could call a demo reel with Hype Morgan that included Surfin' and other tunes like Luau, Karate, Surfer Girl. And through doing that, they were signed to Capitol Records in 1962. And believe it or not, Mike Love was the only member of the group who didn't need a parental signature because all the other members, including Brian, were younger than 21. So almost overnight, the Beach Boys become hugely successful. And, we could get into the weeds of the day by day, but we don't need to in this case. Uh, but the boys were signed to Capitol, and, at this point, they were new to playing their instruments. So Dennis took up the drums, Carl and David and Al played guitars, and you had Brian, who was really a piano player first, pick up the bass, and Brian became the band's bass player. And as a unit, they made several, classic surf rock albums and released a ton of singles. And Brian's main collaborator at this time was his cousin Mike, and they wrote the bulk of the songs for the Beach Boys together. But that's not to say that Brian didn't have some other very talented collaborators, and that included Gary Usher, who was another Southern California musician. It included Roger Christian, who was a DJ who wrote the lyrics to a lot of car songs. That includes Bob Norberg, who was Brian's roommate in the early 60s. And last but not least, that includes Jan Berry, who Brian wrote his first number one hit with, which was Surf City, which was ultimately recorded by Jane and Dean and was Brian's first national number one hit. So around this time, Jan really took Brian under his wing and taught Brian how to produce. Because before this, you had Nick Vinay from Capitol and Murray handling the production. But Jan took Brian under his wing, showed him how the electronics worked, showed him how he could work with studio musicians instead of using his brothers. And he just gave Brian the tools to be able to produce himself. So after learning from Jan, Brian became the Beach Boys' official producer, starting with their Surfer Girl
Mhm.
single and album of the same name. And so the Beach Boys were cranking out hits, hit after hit after hit. Surfer Girl, Surfing USA, Be True to Your School, In My Room. The list is endless. They were really, Brian particularly was totally on fire in this era. And a really pivotal moment for Brian as far as these early days go is his introduction to the music of Phil Spector. And Jan may have taught Brian about the nuts and bolts of producing, but Phil Spector was the person who inspired Brian to elevate his production to an even grander, more lush and beautiful level. So, yeah, that takes us to around 1963, 1964. Brian's really embracing that wall of sound style. He's bringing in a lot of session musicians, and he achieves his first number one with the band I Get Around. So that leads us to a good point where we can talk about, the band's heyday when they were really on top of the charts, on top of the world in the mid 60s.
Yeah, well, so the first thing I'd want to add to that is that, you kind of mentioned how, Brian really kind of secured production control over those early records and those early singles. And that was really a big deal at the time. I know that originally it was Nick Benet, I believe, was credited as producer, but really Brian was kind of leading the charge there and doing the production work, which at the time, like record labels, it was more so up to them, in terms of who would produce the music and everything. But Brian wanted to take control, he wanted to, show his influence on the music. And those early records, you can really kind of hear Brian developing as a producer, which is something that I've always really appreciated listening to them. You listen to something like Surfer Girl, and you can already kind of hear the complexities of the production. And then you go to the following year with I Get Around, and you can hear the production continue to evolve throughout those early records. So I think that's something that's really cool with a lot of bands, but especially with the Beach Boys, just because like Brian, I feel like Brian's production really evolved really quickly, over a very short period of time. So.
Yeah, no, you can definitely see it like really progress fast. I mean, like even if you just compare like say Surfin' in 1961 to the stuff you hear on Surfer Girl in 1963, I mean, it's only 2 years, but it feels like in just 2 years we're seeing a tremendous amount of artistic growth. And I think Brian was actually one of the very first artists to write, produce, compose, arrange, and play some of his own material. And
Mhm.
I think there's a quote that Carl said that like Capitol was very hesitant to do that because this is from the era when, especially like a lot of art, back in those days, it was like you had an A&R guy that would assign you to a producer, and a lot of times too, you'd have a team of songwriters. that would just craft the whole album for you, and you were just kind of like singing on the record, and then that's it. And Carl even mentioned that Capitol was very hesitant to let Brian do that, but like you said, the records were great and they sold. So they just decided to let him do that. And I think that that kind of helped pave the way for a lot of artists that came after him. Your Stevie Wonders, your Marvin Gayes, your Princes, artists like that that really would come in and do like a lot of that, like have a lot of creative control and like just in the studio, just doing what they wanted. And it's pretty awesome.
In many ways, this is maybe is my favorite era of the band. I'm a really big fan of like 63 to 65 especially, but you see a lot of not just production wise by Brian, but like just songwriting wise, just not like gradually getting like exponentially getting better. Like each song was two times better than the last. You have Surfin', Surfin' Safari, Surfin' USA, Surfer Girl, and then you get to like Don't Worry Baby, and it's just absolutely nuts. Warmth of the Sun, just incredible stuff. Each song was just way better than the last. And then you add on the production aspect, and it's just absolutely incredible. You have some of my favorite songs that he ever wrote. Your Summer Dream was in 63, using almost strictly jazz chords. Like there was no just like A major to D major or to E anymore. It's like A major 7 and it's going to all that crap, and it's so incredible. And then beyond the Beach Boys, you have him writing stuff for other artists. Like Nate mentioned, you have Jan and Dean. He did Surfer or Surfing, not Surfing USA, Surf City, and then he wrote I think New Girl in School with Bob Norberg for them.
Dead
And then
Man's Curve, Ride the
yep,
Wild Surf.
Sidewalk Surfing. And then you have the stuff he did with Survivors, which I mean, there's only two songs, but even those kind of showed where he's adding horns and saxes and all sorts of stuff to his production. That's around the time of Little Deuce Coupe. It definitely helps that in 63 he took a big break from touring, which allowed him to do a lot of stuff. He wrote stuff for the Honeys. He produced stuff for the Honeys, and he was becoming well known, not necessarily as just that guy from the Beach Boys, but as that 20, 21-year-old kid who is writing, producing, and arranging stuff for not just his band, but for many other artists.
Yeah, I think, looking at, all of the output that Brian put out during this period, like you said, like with the Honeys and all these other different groups, I think really at that time, Brian, he was never really looking for, the fame of like, oh, I'm going to be leading the band on stage. I think he really just wanted to, be an accomplished songwriter, and an accomplished producer. And I think that that meant a great deal to him. And I think, you look at the band's early years and already like in like 1963, Brian already didn't really want to be going on the road much. Al was kind of taking his place on stage already at that point. So, I think Brian was always more interested in kind of the behind the scenes stuff. He was more interested in writing the songs, producing the songs. And then, he wanted hit singles, obviously. He wanted music that people appreciated and he wanted music that people really connected with. So, I think that those early albums, sometimes, we joke that they're a little bit spotty in places, but I think there's a lot of charm to them and you can really hear the complexity of a lot of these songs. Like Riley mentioned, Your Summer Dream. That's a song that we've said before, almost sounds like it could be like a modern indie song with a very stripped back production and arrangement. You look at something like In My Room, which has a really lush and beautiful arrangement. So many just gorgeous songs from that period. And then obviously you have the great rock and roll tracks too, like Surfin' USA and Fun, 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 which you guys mentioned. The songs have so much great energy and they really kind of show all of the influences that Brian was pulling from, but then also making his own. You hear elements of Phil Spector in the production on those songs, as well as Chuck Berry in the guitar playing and the Four Freshmen with the vocal harmonies. So I think really a lot of those early singles really do show kind of all of Brian's influences coming together into one. So I think that's really cool. All right, so now as we move on to 1964, which is kind of when the band started having more success worldwide, just beyond the U.S. And this is also the point where they began kind of their friendly rivalry with the Beatles, where both bands were regularly charting. In the U.S., you had "I Get Around" go to number one, which was the Beach Boys' first number one single. Meanwhile, the Beatles were having big singles around that time and were super popular, appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show. And this was also around the time that Brian started having some major difficulties and challenges, some of which relating to kind of his mental struggles over the years. So, Nate, do you kind of want to get into some of that, kind of the band's like explosive burst in popularity around 1964 and also kind of the challenges that Brian was dealing with?
Yeah, you perfectly articulated the two main points that I wanted to make.
Mm-hmm.
But, the Beach Boys sort of transcendence to a national group from just a touring group happened once they hooked up with Fred Vale, and Fred Vale became their promoter, and they started doing these national tours and started playing for really big audiences, including a show in Minnesota in late 63, early 64, around then, where the kids were literally smashing the windows of the venue to get in to see the Beach Boys. And they started screaming, and Brian made a joke that he thought there was a fire from all the screams. And so, at this point, they're really climbing the ladder, so to speak. And by the time the Beatles came to America, they were essentially taking the Beatles on, as an equal, as their American counterpart, so to speak. And I think in many ways that scared Brian and frightened him, but in other ways it sort of put a fire under his butt and brought out that competitive spirit from when he was an athlete, that same competitive thing going on. That also gets us to the point where, like Jake mentioned, the touring just became too much for Brian. And I think it was a combination of anxiety and, hardly getting any sleep and all of the wear and tear on your body that comes from being on the road. But also something which we haven't mentioned yet. Another reason that performing was hard for Brian was that the guy was deaf in one ear. And, many people think that could have come from Murray's abuse. Some people think that that was just happenstance. But, either way, Brian was deaf in one of his ears. So performing on stage, especially back then when there weren't monitors and in-ears and all the luxuries that performers have today, was really a challenge for Brian. So in December of that year, he finally, called it quits as being a member of the touring group, and he was replaced on the road by the legendary Glenn Campbell, and soon after that, Bruce Johnston. And not being on the road gave Brian significant amount of time to craft his beautiful music. And while all of this is going on, another significant thing happens in Brian's life, and that is the introduction of substances into his orbit. And, that began really casually with a little bit of drinking or a little bit of pot smoking. And, within the next few years, that sort of quickly ballooned into LSD and, pills and other things that were more, let's call it high risk, high reward. And so that sort of catapults Brian into this new era of just extreme creativity, whether that was the wall of sound style production of Pet Sounds, or the humor of Smile, or the kind of lo-fi DIY vibe of the Party album. It just really gets Brian into this new space where he's just so open to ideas and, firing at a pace that, even made what he was doing the few years earlier look quaint. He was really just growing so much as an artist with all the new time he had and some of those new influences. So that sort of gets us to the mid 60s and the era in which Brian was really just setting the bar for the production race in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Two things that I wanted to add. It's worth mentioning that in 1964, the group dismissed Murray, Brian's father, as manager, which, Murray had really helped get the group big. He really played a big part in the band achieving the success that they did in their early years. He went around to stations and spread the word about them and helped promote them. But he also wanted to contribute to the songwriting. And a lot of times, you listen to some of these recordings of him engaging with Brian, and a lot of times he was really kind of being intrusive, and trying to think that he could contribute in the same way that Brian could, when in reality, Brian really was the leader of the group and had the musical talent that, Murray obviously always aspired to have, being a songwriter himself, and always kind of dreaming and to have success in music. But, really Brian was at that point the biggest talent of the family, and his influence, I think, was sometimes having a very negative impact. So Brian just they went up to him and dismissed him as manager, which I know was a very emotional thing for him, for Murray, because he really kind of viewed, the band was his family, really. And to have them come up to him and just kind of say, like, you're done, we're going to do this on our own now. I think that it really hurt him, but I also think that it kind of gave Brian and the group a little bit more freedom, kind of not having to worry about appeasing him. It's also worth mentioning too that in 1964, another big breaking point for Brian, which is kind of the point where you see him kind of really transition from being on the road to being in the studio and writing at home, was when he had the mental breakdown while on a flight, I believe to Houston, where basically he kind of freaked out on the plane and he was just really stressed out about a lot of things. The pressure of writing all these songs for the band and being in charge of all the production, all the arrangements. I believe he also had some difficulties going on with his marriage with Marilyn. So he just got really overwhelmed and stressed, and he had a kind of a mental breakdown on the plane, which was really tough to see for the other members. I think Al said something along the lines of like, I'd never seen something like that before happen to anybody. And it was shortly after that point when Brian told the band, I'm not interested in going on the road anymore. It was also too around this point too where Brian really kind of started to distance himself from the surf themes in the music. Brian, in the early years, those were the singles that really sold. But Brian was maturing as a songwriter, and he wanted to explore more deep and emotional themes beyond just the beach and cars and girls. And you really start to see that on a lot of the mid '60s records, like Today and Summer Days and Summer Nights. So, anything else you guys wanted to add, Riley or Matt?
Well, I know Today is probably one of the first albums, at least from an American group, where you really are seeing like the album being used as a cohesive unit. What was very common, especially like in popular music. Now I know in like different genres, like in it was different, but in popular music, it was very common that the album was basically just like, let's throw the singles on, let's throw some filler on, and let's just pump it out. But with Today, what you're really seeing Brian doing is constructing it as like an actual like total piece. You have the first half, which is the more up-tempo songs, and then you have the second half, which is full of the ballads. While we're on the subject of marijuana and all that, She Knows Me Too Well was actually one of the first songs that Brian wrote under the influence of marijuana. And that song is very dark. It is very much more like intense than a lot of stuff they had been writing before. And just in Today in general, you're seeing songs like, Please Let Me Wonder and When I Grow Up to Be a Man that I think are songs that are like I personally find those are songs that are very relatable. When I Grow Up to Be a Man is about the anxiety of getting older. It's something that I think a lot of us, struggle with and fear with. And then you look at something like Please Let Me Wonder, it's like when you're really in love with someone, like I want to know, like, hey, like, is she really the one that, I'm on her mind all the time? And then you have songs like, In the Back of My Mind, which is beautiful. So what you're really seeing here is just like, as we said before, just like a quantum leap even from they were doing a year before. And just to see that much artistic growth in such a short period of time is really quite incredible. And something that I don't really think you see too much anymore, at least in popular music. I mean, you probably will still see it kind of maybe like in like more of the indie scenes, but I feel like I don't really see that level of artistic growth in popular music from in such a short period of time anymore.
Hell no. I think you guys probably remember this is my favorite Beach Boys album and
Mhm.
is my second favorite album of all time. I know we did that little off time in one and we didn't include Beach Boys albums. This would have been number two. Like the Stone Roses, love. But this, holy shit, this is an album that Please Let Me Wonder is like a song that I wish I could write every single time. I know it might sound crazy, but if I Get Around is my favorite song of all time, but I think in past year, Please Let Me Wonder might have become my favorite Beach Boys song. So I adore that thing.
Mhm.
I think it's so gorgeous. I think it is so hard to play. I don't know how he could have even written that with all the different chord changes going on and the sort of production choices, that little breakdown that comes out of nowhere. He added a whole part to Do You Want to Dance in the beginning of Today.
Mhm.
The format is absolutely, I don't know if it's like nuts. It's not like that crazy, but to have all like the upbeat, fast-paced songs on side one, and then side two, you have all these slow, gorgeous ballads. It may have not been like mind-blowingly like creative, but it was a step in the right direction. And you can easily see why this is like why many this is the one that people say is like, oh, this is Pet Sounds before Pet Sounds, or like one of the stepping stones. But one of my other favorite albums of all time is actually All Summer Long.
Mm.
I think that this was the stepping stone to today in the sense that it had one conceptual theme. And while you have Don't Back Down as that surf song, none of the other songs really mention surfing. I mean, you have Girls on the Beach and you have All Summer Long and Little Honda's like a car song, but it's definitely a lot more mature than Let's Go Surfing Now Everybody's Learning How.
Mhm.
And I think the production choices, it doesn't sound like Surfing USA. It sounds more like today than it does Surfing USA. It has the summer themes. It's a very bright and happy album, but like this, the production choices, the arrangements, he's adding more instruments. Like I think is it the marimba? That's the dun, 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 dun. Nate could probably correct me as
Yep,
like the
marimba.
intro rather than Carl just playing a riff on his guitar. So I'm also a big fan of this one, and I'm very happy that we got those two right back to back. I think is absolutely incredible.
I think you make a really good point that I never thought of before, but that album is kind of like the bridge between like your Surfer Girl and your Today, where like you still kind of have like the songs about like summer and having fun, but you're also kind of seeing like the more complex arrangements. You're seeing things like your Will Runaways and your Hushabyes, which is a beautiful cover, kind of like coming in there. And then I would say even all summer long, that song to me kind of has a tinge of melancholy in it. Especially I think when you watch it in context of American Graffiti. I think that
Oh
that
yeah, that's where I found it. It was it was through
I,
American Graffiti.
I think that and even though I know like technically that's not it shouldn't have been in American Graffiti in the sense that that movie takes place in 62, but it still fits in with the film.
Yeah.
I think that like you're starting to even see in that album like with certain songs like there's something brewing deeper beneath the surface.
And then one more album I think we should mention is Summer Days.
Mm.
Um, it's actually a very similar album. Especially I think in arrangement and just themes to this. Like I'm kind of surprised that you have Today after this and then you have Summer Days because I think like sonically and like thematically it would make more sense. Regardless, I side one's a bit it's good, but it's not as strong. But side two of Summer Days, absolutely incredible. Let
Mm.
'Em Run Wild, You're So Good to Me. Is You're So Good to Me on side two?
Yep. It's
Yes, You're So Good to Me. Um, two of the Brian's best tracks. I don't know. It's just magical song, and it's that whole album is so sunshine and bright, and not in a way of like all summer long, even though I like that one better, or like Surfing USA or Surfing Safari. It's just you could tell where Brian was going, and gorgeous.
Yeah, I personally have always kind of seen Summer Days as a little bit of a quote unquote compromise record. And what I mean by that is like you kind of are taking like the more complex arrangements of say, but you're still kind of throwing in kind of like the summer, this is what we're known for kind of thing. Ironically enough, this was actually their highest charting studio album, if you can believe that, on the Billboard 200, peaked at number two. I will say that yes, there are some tracks in here that are absolutely amazing. I think that California Girls is an absolutely mind-blowing piece of music. I think that the arrangement on that song is incredible. I think the production is sublime. I think Brian has one time said that that was his favorite piece of music he ever wrote. I can definitely see that. And then you have Let 'Em Run Wild, which I know that Brian was never crazy for that vocal. Personally, I think that that song is amazing. I think that it is a great homage to. It's very Bacharach-y to me. That's what it kind of sounds like he's doing. Um, Absolutely wonderful song. Kind of gives me chills sometimes when I listen to it. And I think that Carl and Dennis have both said when they first heard that song, that was kind of when they really realized how talented Brian really was because it just kind of like made them like, holy shit. And yeah, You're So Good to Me is wonderful too. Big fan of Summer Days actually. I haven't heard it in a while, but there's some other tracks I really like on it. Girl Don't Tell Me I think is a really nice kind of Brian's twist on Ticket to Ride. Um, and then
Girl from New York City is a banger.
yeah, that one's fun too. And then I think Summer Needs Means New Love is kind of like a taste of what you got on Pet Sounds with things like Let's Go Away for a While. So yeah, very
Oh, Miranda.
El Miranda,
Both
of course, too.
songs.
Yep, number one hit. Banger. Yeah, very fun record.
Um, yeah, to just sort of echo what you guys said today, big leap forward. I think after Brian starts using drugs, all the records before this point have a very clean sound. You can very easily differentiate those Fender guitars and Dennis's drums and hear the vocals. And all of a sudden, when he gets into that whole drug scene and you get to Today and Summer Days, I think there's like a haze. over the music. And all of a sudden, things sort of have this blurred aspect to the music where all the instruments are blending together and there's so much, echo and delay and studio wizardry going on. So, thus you get those two great albums, Today and Summer Days, which have this amazing blend, like you guys alluded to, of the surf rock vibe that the band was known for, and sort of this new hint of psychedelia to all of it. So you also get to, Summer Days and the Party album, and Brian now has six voices to work with instead of what had always been five. So now with Bruce in the band, the harmonies instantly get a lot more lush and dreamy, not only because of Bruce's kind of light voice, but because Brian had another voice for the ensemble. And so the chords had that one extra voicing that could make them, even thicker or even more moving. And so, yeah, by this time, Brian's, arranging is just so out of sight, so creative. I think it's really, I think people forget, in my opinion, how innovative the Party album actually was. It created sort of the whole genre of that MTV Unplugged thing that would happen down the road. And not only that, but the way that they were infusing the laughing and the talking on top of the music totally foreshadows Smiley Smile and some of that stuff that happened a few years later. So, the Party album gave them another huge smash hit with Barbara Ann, which I don't think Brian expected to become one of his signature songs.
Neither did
But
Jake.
yeah, but nonetheless, it did. And that song's just got an amazing sound with Brian and his old buddy Dean Torrance singing that lead together. And it's kind of a full circle moment because Jan and Dean did Barbara Ann so many years earlier before the Beach Boys started. And I think that inspired the Beach Boys. And so now to have Brian and Dean singing together, the song tops the charts and it buys Brian some time to continue working on his, crowning achievement, and that is Pet Sounds.
Want to give a shout out to another single that came out around this time, "The Little Girl I Once Knew," um, which I think is kind of like that's often been cited also too as like a bit of a foreshadowing for Pet Sounds because like of how there's like the different sections in the song and how it shifts between like the parts where it's like very heavily orchestrated and then it's like part of it is just silence. Really, really great song. Unfortunately, wasn't really a massive hit. I think they say it's because like it just had so I think the FCC didn't really like songs that had like the silence in between because they didn't want any dead air. But it did get a glowing review from John Lennon, who said, "This is the greatest. Turn it up. Turn it right up. It's got to be a hit. It's the greatest record I've heard for weeks. It's fantastic. I hope it will be a hit. It's all Brian Wilson. He just uses the voices as instruments. He never tours or anything. He just sits at home thinking up fantastic arrangements out of his head. Doesn't even read music. You keep waiting for the fabulous breaks. Great arrangement. It goes on and on with all different things. I hope it's a hit so I can hear it all the time." Yeah, that's a pretty glowing endorsement. And apparently George Harrison was also a big fan. He kept it in his
I think he had a copy of it. Like, do you think George, like, in the 80s did a thing where he's like, this is my jukebox records?
Mm.
And I think he had both California Girls and The Little Girl I Once Knew. I mean, I know he had Little Girl I Once Knew.
He did have California Girls, but he said he mainly kept it in for Let Him Run Wild because he said
Yep. Yep. Something I wanted to add, kind of going back a little bit, but I really liked Nate's comment about how like after Brian started experimenting more with drugs and marijuana and LSD, like the music had more of a haze to it. I think of the song that kind of came to mind for me was "In the Back of My Mind," where you have so much going on in that backing track, with the Wrecking Crew musicians who, around this time Brian really started using them more. He had used them a bit, on the earlier records, but this was really around the time when, when Brian was at home more and not touring with the band and was able to work on the music more, where he was bringing in, Carol Kay and Hal Blaine and all these musicians. And on that song in particular, like the string section and the horns. And then at the end where there's like that musical breakdown where like it all kind of like collapses, like that's just like, it has such a cool sound to it. And I'm not sure. Obviously the drugs did have a negative impact on Brian's life in the future, but in terms of the songwriting and the creativity of the production, I'm not sure if Brian could have achieved something like that without some of the use of marijuana and some of those drugs. So Brian has said that the drugs did have a negative impact on his life, to an extent, especially as in the following years with Smile and everything. But I do think that with musicians and with artists in general, sometimes you can get a burst of creativity from those kinds of things. And I think that in this case, Brian even said with California Girls, that intro he wrote, while he was on drugs. And it is an incredible intro. And I think he said that's like one of his most proud musical moments, that he ever wrote. So yeah, I really love a lot of this stuff from this era. Like you guys said, Let 'Em Run Wild is one of my all-time favorite Beach Boys songs. Please Let Me Wonder is one of my all-time favorite Beach Boys songs. And then, with Party, like you guys said too, it's kind of like an interesting contrast. You go from these really lush productions, these really like melancholic ballads, to this really loose and fun album that like they basically intended to sound like that. You have like the laughing and the talking over it, which, the first time I heard it, I thought, that's kind of annoying, but honestly, like re-listening to it, it really does add to the loose vibe of the music, and I think of songs on there like the Beatles covers, like with I Should Have Known Better. I think that's a really great, fun, loose cover. Songs like Devoted to You, really beautiful. I believe that's Everly Brothers cover. So yeah, I just think that's a really fun album, and like you said, Nate, it kind of was a way to put out something to the general public while Brian worked on what would be his masterpiece. So
Yeah. I think I really like that you mentioned the part about like the hazy feeling of in the back of my mind because I almost feel like with that song, it almost sounds like Dennis is kind of getting swamped in the arrangement because
mhm.
it's so much, it's such a dense production. But I kind of like that. It kind of like it adds to, in my opinion, it adds to the feeling of the song. I also wanted to give a shout out on Party. I love his cover of "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away." I think that Dennis had a very emotive voice, and I think he did a really, really nice rendition of a John classic with that one, the John Lennon classic. Yeah, Party's an album that I've also really always quite liked too. Especially for the fact that like it was kind of a quote unquote throwaway record, and yet like it's pretty damn good. Like it just kind of shows to you like how like effortlessly talented these guys were. Like they could literally just like basically do something as like almost a joke, and it's like that good.
All right, so now obviously after Party, Brian puts out Pet Sounds while the band was touring, I believe, in Japan. Brian was at home in California working on Pet Sounds at various studios around the state. Obviously, a lot of Wrecking Crew musicians involved with this record, playing the backing tracks on all these songs. You also have Tony Asher contributing a lot of the lyrics. So obviously, Pet Sounds was such an influential and an amazing album. And Brian really, it was basically, as Brian said, it was pretty much a response to what the Beatles were doing at the time, with Rubber Soul, where they put out an album that was pretty much completely cohesive, no filler. And Brian basically wanted to put out a record like that, where he could take all the time that he needed to make it. And, an album that you could listen to from start to finish without skipping any tracks and something that you could enjoy as a full, complete piece of art. So I think for that reason, a lot of Beach Boys fans kind of consider this, Brian's peak period. So Nate, do you kind of want to talk about, the impact of Pet Sounds and also just like, Brian putting together the record and as well as Smile?
Yeah, so man, this era, Pet Sounds is really the culmination of everything Brian had been working towards throughout the 60s. You've got the Phil Spector inspired lush backing tracks. You've got the really dense harmonies. The most beautiful harmonies ever put on tape can be found on this Pet Sounds album. And you have Brian working with a huge array of session musicians, and Brian's experimenting with so many different genres. You've got him reinterpreting a folk song with Sloop John B. You've got a sort of guitar centric, psychedelic, exotic rocker with the title track, Pet Sounds. The album is filled with strings and horns and a wide array of different keyboard instruments from pianos to organs to Wurlitzers. And it really just is like I said, the culmination of everything that's happened to this point. You still, in my opinion, have a summery feel to the affair, like to me, even though Wouldn't It Be Nice or Sloop John B don't specifically talk about surfing or hot rods, they still very much evoke feelings of summer and youth. And so really, Pet Sounds is just Brian bearing his soul and creating music truly from the heart. Whereas a lot of the songs that he and Mike wrote earlier were about fads, whether it was surfing or hot rods or root beer or amusement parks, whatever just fads. And you get to Pet Sounds, and Brian's really focused on making music that is just truly timeless. And so, this album in particular has gone on to, you know, be on the tops of the lists of so many album rankings. It is praised by so many artists from the 60s all the way through today. People like Paul McCartney praise the album as inspiring and one of the crowning achievements of rock and roll. So, I mean, what can you say other than that it's Pet Sounds, which changed music forever, even if it was not initially a huge success, it still has influence in 2025.
Yeah, I think that this is definitely Brian's crowning achievement, but I think that we also can't not give Tony Asher the credit that he deserves because and I truly think as a true collaboration
Mhm.
because I don't know, this is just a collaboration that happened at the right place and at the right time with the right people because I think Brian's music evoked a certain emotion in this record, and Tony Asher's words could not have matched the songs more. And I know Brian definitely had a involvement in the words, but it's also been reported that Tony had involvement in some of the music. So I think that maybe one of the greatest collaborations of all time because I don't know, the music there's not much I think I could change about this record. And I think the instrumentals themselves are also I know I'm a bit controversial with this. They're some of my favorite tracks on the album. Let's Go Away for a While might be my favorite track on the record. I've always thought the title track was a banger. When me and Nate saw Sail on perform it live, I know I was going batshit, even though Nate was like on the other side of the little auditorium because I got the wrong seat. But man, there's so much to say, but there's also nothing new I think I could mention about the record.
Yeah, I know. I think, like you said, Riley, I think the blend of, the really moving and beautifully arranged, backing tracks from Brian with those lyrics, like you could not ask for a better pairing. I think of songs like Don't Talk and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. Obviously, God Only Knows. Like those songs, like the arrangements are just absolutely beautiful in the way that Brian incorporated all of the different instruments. But then Tony Asher's lyrics, like they really are what, make them so moving and so relatable. Like as much as I love the music, like those lyrics are really what elevate the songs to another level for me and what keeps me coming back to them. I think of songs too, like I'm Waiting for the Day, where you have that really cool heavy drum opening, like the bum, 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 bum. But then the really moving lyrics, that follow that. So, yeah, I just think it's a just absolutely amazing album, and I can see why so many people love it today and consider it like the highlight of the Beach Boys catalog. I can also see why at the time some people struggled with it. I know the first time that I heard this album, I kind of struggled with it as well. But then with repeated listening, I really started to appreciate these songs a lot more and really just from everything, really the production, the arrangements, the lyrics, they're just incredible tracks. And it's an album that really does work from start to finish. It really is a listening experience from the opening track with Wouldn't It Be Nice, which is really uplifting and catchy song, but also with an underlying melancholy to it, to the final track, Caroline No, which is just like a really gorgeous, melancholic and moving ballad. So, just an amazing record. And while I wouldn't say it's like my personal favorite Beach Boys album, I wouldn't argue against anybody that, consider this the best thing that Brian ever did, because I absolutely think that it is. So,
Yeah, this I know that when we did our ranking, this I used to say this was like my favorite Beach Boys album, and I wouldn't say it is anymore, but I still think it's an absolutely amazing piece of work. I also want to give a shout out. He hasn't been mentioned yet, but Chuck Britz, I think, deserves a shout out for his amazing engineering work, not only on this, but on a lot of the Beach Boys' early work. I really feel like he was like another kind of missing piece of the puzzle there, especially because his ears helped when Brian, because obviously we know Brian is deaf and was deaf in one ear, so like Brian couldn't hear stereo. Chuck Britz was able to create some very wonderful stereo mixes. I know that Pet Sounds did not get a contemporary. stereo mix, but like for some of the earlier stuff, a lot of the Beach Boys stereo mixes are much better than some of the early Beatles stuff. And I know that's a combination too of the different types of tapes they had because the Beach Boys had 4 track and 8 track much earlier than the Beatles did. The Beatles were still recording on twin track, but definitely
If
one.
the Beach Boys got a track, why you remember that scene from Get Back when Paul McCartney's like jealous that the Beach Boys have more tape than they do?
Yeah, well, that's just, America got a lot of those innovations faster, especially in California. That's where, like, I mean,
Yeah, the Gold Star Studios.
the Gold Star Studios, exactly like Mickey Dolenz, and a little bit off topic, Mickey Dolenz bought one of the first Moog synthesizers at the Monterey Pop Festival. So yeah, that's just good. A lot of stuff was came to California first. But I do want to say I'm not going to get too much into depth about Pet Sounds, but I do want to say this one quote. I think this is a very good quote. This is from the music critic Jeff Stratton, and he said, It's been said that although hardly anyone bought the Velvet Underground's records, those who did ended up being inspired to start their own bands. In the case of the Beach Boys' 1966 opus Pet Sounds, it's likely that each of its 13 songs inspired its own subset of pop offspring. And I think that you definitely can make a case for that. I think that there's like each song you can kind of see like where each track on the record influenced like a different subgenre of popular music.
Mhm.
So true. And Paul McCartney said that he thinks you're not musically educated till you've heard Pet Sounds. And I totally agree. When I'm recording people, I always am practically begging them to listen to Pet Sounds. I think it's just so important for anyone that wants to make music to hear that album because I've never met someone that has heard it and hasn't been blown away and had their impression of music changed by listening to that album,
There's
including the Beatles, who, you hear Sergeant Pepper and the Pet Sounds influence just could not be more pronounced. And, I can't think of a higher compliment than having the Beatles be trying to copy your sound.
Yeah. I look at songs, from Sergeant Pepper's, like Fixing a Hole and She's Leaving Home. And then also, on Revolver with Here, There, and Everywhere, which I think Paul said was almost like a response to God Only Knows. So, those songs, you can definitely hear the influence, whether you say it's like the Baroque sound or just lyrically. But obviously the Beatles were very influenced by Pet Sounds. And, I think Bruce was the one who first played the Pet Sounds material for Paul and John, I believe, at their hotel room, right, Nate? When he came
Right, yeah.
over. And I remember, I think that they said that they were just blown away by it. They just could not believe what they were hearing and what Brian had, produced while the band was out touring. And Brian had put together these just absolutely just gorgeous arrangements with all of these session musicians. So,
there's actually a story. So Questlove kind of talks about how like growing up he never really listened to the Beach Boys because he thought they were just kind of corny. And when he was in London, he had first heard Pet Sounds for the first time, and he was just blown away by it. And he was really excited when the box set came out, the big Pet Sound Session box set, and he bought it at a record store. And his friends were kind of like making fun of him for it. He's like, "Nah, you gotta check this out," and they were just blown away by it. So it just goes to show that like, even someone like that you would, I wouldn't think like, he's super influenced by the Beach Boys, but like, this record had a mind-blowing impact, had like a big impact on him.
the last thing I'll add relating to Pet Sounds, one of the coolest things that I heard, and I first heard this, I believe, 2 or 3 years ago. There's this track that Brian put together, this like vocal track or vocal tape, where he basically, for the song Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder, he did each of the instrumental parts that, he was imagining in his head. He recorded them as vocal parts and put them together into one like blended recording. And it's like one of the most haunting and like ethereal things, I've ever heard musically. You can find it on YouTube. I believe it might have been included on one of the Pet Sound sets. I'm not sure, but it's basically Brian doing the vocal part for each of the instruments that would eventually be on Don't Talk. And I believe the purpose of it was to kind of give the session musicians an idea of what he was going for with the song. But it really is beautiful, and it really kind of shows how talented Brian was as an arranger. So I definitely recommend checking that out if any of our listeners haven't heard it before. So later in 1966, the Beach Boys, of course, also put out Good Vibrations, which is widely considered to be one of the greatest singles of all time. Just a absolutely incredible song, production wise, lyrically. I think Mike did a great job with the lyrics on that. And then with the production and arrangement, you have that really cool sawing cello part, the cool use of the electro theremin, just a lot of really cool production tricks with the song. And you can tell that, it was costly to make because the fact that this came out when it did, it really is like mind blowing, with the technology that they had then, that Brian put out something that's just absolutely incredible. So Nate, do you kind of want to talk about, good vibrations and also how, the how this kind of led to the smile sessions and all of that?
Yeah, so around the time of creating Pet Sounds, Brian and Mike began playing with this concept of, Brian remembered from when he was a kid about wondering why dogs barked at certain people and not other people. And uh, Brian's mom made some remark that it was about like the vibrations that the dogs got from the people or something along those lines. And, you know, years and years later, as adults, Mike and Brian were remembering that story and trying to convey that theme into a song. And so not only was that a unique angle to write a song from, but also Brian was getting into a whole new bag with his production that you could essentially refer to as modular production, meaning that uh, up until this point, most songs were recorded as one piece of music. You have all the musicians and they play the song all the way through, and that's the song. And you've got verse, chorus, and traditional pop songwriting. And then you have Brian just bring in this idea from way left field. And Brian thought, well, what if we record these little fragments of music that are at different tempos and different keys, recorded at different studios, and try to blend them all together into one song. And so Brian began producing Good Vibrations. He used, half a dozen studios all around the Southern California area, spent an unheard of amount of money producing this song, incorporating the weird instruments like the theremin and the jaw harp and fuzz bass and cello and all these wacky instruments, and just recorded these very tiny fragments. And he was experimenting and trying to put them together in all sorts of different orders. And he made version after version of the song with different sections, and he just couldn't get it to have that through line that made it a commercial record instead of just a sound experiment. And that's where you have Mike come in with the those classic verses about the colorful clothes she wears and the way the sunlight plays upon her hair, and adding that sort of romance aspect to the song. And Mike's incredible hook, and then just together with Brian's production and Mike's songwriting, you just get maybe what I at least would consider the all-time classic 1960s record, maybe the greatest single of all time. I couldn't think of one better. And it becomes, at this point, the Beach Boys' biggest song. And, you got all the boys singing on it, and the song just took the world by storm. And so that led Brian to want to make an entire album's worth of material, all in that modular production format. And that's how we get to the Smile Sessions, where Brian attempted to make an entire album in the way that he made Good Vibrations, which, we know ultimately almost destroyed him, but it definitely gave us some beautiful music.
For sure. Um, yeah, I think it's one of the greatest songs ever written. I think that the production is out of this world. I do also like the well, it hasn't been mentioned yet, but like the organ part that Dennis contributed. I think that's a really nice part. I think that I actually like Mike's lyrics better than the original lyrics that Tony Asher wrote for
Oh,
this. I think that Mike kind of was able to put it in a way that more commercial. This was also a massive hit, thankfully, for good reason. I think this was their first song that actually went to number one in both the States and in the UK. So that's really cool. And this is also like I would say one of like it's one of those songs that's like made up of like the different sections. I know like it's been described as like a pocket symphony where it's like you have like the different sections making up the one song. So like kind of like, songs you would hear later are like A Day in the Life or like and of course the famous Bohemian Rhapsody. Um, I think this is better than Bohemian Rhapsody personally because I think that song is just way overplayed. And if I never heard it again, I wouldn't even be sad.
Galileo, Galileo, let me go, let me go.
But yeah, I just think it's an amazing, amazing song, and arguably the peak of Brian's work in the studio.
Yeah, I mean, you could dissect each individual part of the song, and every part of it's mind blowing. You just look at the vocals, the way the vocals are arranged, the backing track itself, the lyrics that Mike wrote. Pretty much the whole thing, is just a masterpiece, and you can see why it's become one of the, why it's looked at as one of the defining songs of the entire 1960s. You can listen to pretty much anything from that time, and there's nothing that really sounds like this. It really is like a mind blowing song for the time that it came out. So,
And nothing since sounds quite like it either.
right, for sure.
It kicks Bohemian Rhapsody's ass. Not even close. I mean, I always hear how, oh, the Queen was the first band to like really do songs with sections and listen to this and that, listen to the harmonies. And Brian Wilson did it about like 10 years ago. And he didn't do it once. He did it about like probably 5+ times. If you include like the finished stuff, and they're all better than Bohemian Rhapsody. Like I'm not even the biggest fan of like Essence. I mean, actually, I've grown to like it quite a bit, but I still think that still kicks its ass. But like besides Good Vibrations, which is like arguably one of the most creative songs ever written, Heroes and Villains is one of my personal favorites from this, I guess, era. I'm a big fan of Heroes and Villains, especially the Smile Sessions version. I really like how that one uses the sections to kind of tell a story almost, and the harmonies are still on there. I think Carl gets an incredible vocal, and even though it was probably all of these songs were the biggest pain in the ass to record, you got a lot of beautiful music out of it. Do I think it's the greatest thing that they've ever did? Like all together, the Smile stuff? No, but it is still very impressive and very creative and very well arranged. Um, but like I'm Heroes and Villains and Good Vibrations are two of my favorite songs from the group, and it's just truly mind blowing. Like I don't mean that as like a hyperbole. Like it's actually mind blowing that somebody could write this music.
And the just pure ability that went into engineering it is also truly a modern marvel. We're all so used to having these things and computers, and that has made recording so much easier, especially that modular style that I keep referring to is really like extremely commonplace nowadays. Nowadays, it's very not unusual to have a song recorded at a few different studios and cut and paste together. But back in the day when Brian was making this music, he wasn't, Command C, that kind of cut and paste. He was literally cutting the tape with scissors and pasting it back together with like glue or a tape, like it is just a marvel that they made this music sound so seamless and beautiful with how rudimentary the technology was.
Yeah, actually, that brings me to I want to quote this. This is Bob Dylan. He said one time about Brian, Jesus that year, he should donate it to the Smithsonian. Brian Wilson, he made all his records with 4 tracks, but you couldn't make his records if you had 100 tracks today. And that's true. I
So
mean,
true.
it was just like I remember actually I had a coworker one time when I was explaining to her how they made that song, and she was just her mind was blown. That like I was like, she's like they really were splicing and um splicing tape and taping it back together. I said, yes, that's how they used to do it. And you had to be very precise. And, tape wears out, so you had to be very careful too. It's not like today where, like you said, Nate, you can just copy paste and just snap everything to a grid and just run it through Pro Tools or whatever and call it a day.
Yeah, there's no undo button in 1966.
Nope. And so if you splice the tape wrong, you better hope you can put it back together.
So as I'm sure all of you listening know, as Beach Boys fans, obviously the Smile album was never officially released at the time, for a variety of reasons. Why Brian wasn't able to finish it. Obviously this was kind of during the peak of Brian's like drug usage in the '60s, so his mind was kind of all over the place. And multiple people who knew Brian were very close with him at the time have kind of cited these sessions as kind of like the point where like Brian was really kind of starting to lose it a bit mentally due to the drugs. You look at like
Point of
these
no return.
in Paranoia, you look at the sessions for Fire, Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, where, Brian was convinced that, during the sessions they had somehow caused a building down the street to catch on fire. I mean, those aren't normal thoughts, for somebody to have. And I think that kind of shows the effect that the drugs were having on his mind. You also had some pressures from, the band members themselves, from the other Beach Boys, who were kind of skeptical of the material, which I also do understand, listening to it. I mean, obviously Pet Sounds was a bit different from what they'd been doing, but compared to like this sounds especially out there. Obviously Heroes and Villains was released as a single and did moderately well, but it was still disappointing at the time. Brian was expecting it to be another smash hit, and it really wasn't. So that definitely had a big impact on his confidence in a negative way. And that also, I think, kind of played a role in the album never really being finished. So, Nate, do you kind of want to talk about kind of like the complexities of Brian's kind of life at this time and also like just the Smile tracks in general?
At this time, Brian had been married to Marilyn for a few years, but their marriage certainly wasn't easy. Uh, Brian had feelings for Marilyn's sister, Diane, and by this point, those feelings were kind of bubbling to the surface. So that was adding to the tense scene going on. You also had Brian definitely overindulging in, unhealthy eating. And so, his size increased quite a bit, which, kind of worried his family members. And, like you guys alluded to, he was taking copious amounts of drugs. And, by this point was even like on the brink of overdose or allegedly had overdose experiences. And so things were getting really heavy and scary. And, like you guys said, you had Capital breathing down Brian's neck, trying to get him to make more 409s and Barbara Ann's and those kind of songs. And then you have his bandmates who also happen to be his family members, really unsure of the direction Brian was headed in. And, it was ultimately just you put together all of those ingredients and the house of cards kind of collapsed a bit for Brian's sanity. And that's definitely reflected in the music. And I think Smile is as brilliant as anything ever produced, but it's very clearly the music of someone who's mentally unwell, and so there's definitely a spooky
Mhm.
vibe to the music, kind of haunting element to it. And but at the same time, it's just absolutely brilliant. And like you guys mentioned, it wasn't finished in the late 60s like it was supposed to be. And we'll get to that later down the road. But like I described, situation was getting tough for Brian. Brian had to pull back a little bit. And so with the following few albums that followed the Smile sessions, namely Smiley Smile, Wild Honey, Friends, you start to have far more contribution from Brian's bandmates, Bruce, Al, Dennis, but particularly Carl, really sort of picked up the production reins and became a big help for Brian to get this music across the finish line. And throughout the end of the 60s, you'd have Brian go from being less in charge to almost completely absent of the band's studio work, because, health issues began to overtake his life and become the main, important thing going on. But yeah, so in the late 60s, you still have some really beautiful, gorgeous experimental work. It just became a lot more collaborative.
Hmm. Yeah, I think a common, misconception with the Beach Boys from people that maybe aren't as familiar with their history is that like after the failure of Smile when Brian basically hadn't finished it and released it, to the expectations that he had, that he pretty much immediately like withdrew from the group, which is not true. As Nate mentioned, as the years progressed, that started to happen. When you get to like 2020, by that point, it was really kind of up to the group to put something together because Brian was really kind of struggling mentally around that time. But you look at albums like Smiley Smile and Wild Honey and Friends, and Brian, wrote or co-wrote the majority of those songs, with Mike and like Nate said, with the other members as well. You have a lot of Carl co-writing credits, a lot of Al co-writing credits from this time. You look at the Friends album with Little Bird, which is a Brian, Dennis, and Stephen Kalinich collaboration. So a lot of really great music came out of this era. A lot of it is kind of overshadowed by their earlier 60s work, which a lot of that stuff was obviously a hit, whereas a lot of these songs aren't as well known because these records didn't sell as well. But a lot of great music came from this time. I know a lot of fans, consider these records kind of like their lo-fi albums, in that the production was more stripped back and the arrangements, which I think really has to do with the fact that like Brian was becoming too overwhelmed, with all of the pressures of putting together these really elaborate and symphonic, albums like with Pet Sounds and Smile, and he needed a break. He needed a break, or it was probably going to kill him, because he couldn't keep up with the demands and the pressure that was expected of him. So these albums were kind of like an escape for Brian and a way for him to still put out music, but not to the like extreme level that they were doing with Pet Sounds and Smile, these crazy, crazy productions and arrangements. But this period of the band's history, I really love a lot of these songs. I think Brian wrote some incredible tracks in the late 60s. I look at songs like Darlin' and Friends and Busy Doing Nothing and obviously Do It Again, which I know is a big favorite of Nate's. A lot of great songs came out of this era, and I think a lot of people kind of overlook it, but I think the band put out some great music during this time.
Hmm. Well, also too, I know that there's that misconception, the don't fuck with the formula thing, which I think it's fair to say Mike never really actually said that. I think that
Yeah.
was just something that kind of was cooked up by some reporter at Rolling Stone when Rolling Stone was a very influential publication. I think most people now know it's kind of a joke. But yeah, no, I think there's a lot of really great material from that late 60s records, Time to Get Alone,
Yeah.
that Brian wrote, Little Pad, one of my favorites on Wild Honey, Let the Wind Blow,
Yeah.
which I also think Mike wrote some amazing lyrics for that one. I think that his line about, let the bees make honey, let the poor find money is some of the finest lyrics he ever wrote. A lot of very, very enjoyable material there. And yeah, I think like you mentioned, Jake, I think it's kind of like it didn't sell as well, so it isn't as well known. And I think also like the whole Smile thing cast a very long shadow over like the rest of this band's discography. And for a lot of people, like it's the ultimate story of what could have been.
Riley.
I don't really want to talk about Smiles. So, yeah, I mean, the mid 60s, I mean, it's very easy to assume that Smile completely destroyed Brian, and in many ways it did, but he wasn't not present. I think an album like Friends is the prime example. I feel like, if anything, that was like not lines, sorry, I'm dyslexic. Brian's last hurrah of like the 60s records, and then he kind of comes back in the 70s. Like, he still contributes here and there, but past Friends, you have like 2020. He's actually pretty big on Sunflower too, so I guess you could maybe say that. But Friends was the last like real Brian Wilson almost solo production. That was his record, just as much as Smile could have been, and Pet Sounds was, and Love You is, and all those. Because it's a very Brian record, all around. Even though there's some songwriting credits shared. I mean, you see Dennis, Al, Carl, and Bruce in some aspect, like in 2020, like we're present. This late 60s, we're still Brian Wilson led. Um,
Yeah.
but like we said, though, he was gradually kind of slipping out. So,
Yeah.
And one thing we should mention too is a big aspect of why these albums sounded so lo-fi was because they were no longer doing the bulk of their production work at fancy studios like Capitol or Gold Star. They were now doing the majority of their studio work in a makeshift home studio
Mhm.
built in Brian's house. And as the 60s came to a close and the 70s began, the studio became a lot more well equipped, let's call it. But especially around Smiley Smile and Wild Honey, they were using mostly PA equipment and whatever instruments Brian had in the house, whether that be his bass from the touring days or his organ. And, they would record their vocals in the swimming pool or, all these sorts of experiments around the house, recording stuff up on the roof and just all these, trying ways to emulate the sounds they'd get in the studio, but do it at home. But unfortunately, despite all the effort that they put into building the studio in Brian's house, um, eventually he'd hardly step foot in it, and everyone would show up to create music, and the only way they could get Brian to give his input would be to call him from his bedroom and, have him shout down his advice. But, that doesn't mean that his contributions weren't uh, still nonetheless very special as we get into Sunflower and Surf's Up and Holland. Bruce Johnston said at some point in time, I'm paraphrasing, but Bruce said, "Oh, I remember that those albums were a bit of a hyped up lie," as Bruce put it, where the band and the label were really trying to make it seem like Brian was involved, because a lot of the Beach Boys' clout came from Brian's legacy. But really, on these albums, Brian's contributions were few and far between because, he was really struggling at this point, and he actually was dealing with, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the way you say this online. He was dealing with wanting to unalive himself, those kinds of feelings. I don't want the video to get taken down.
Yeah.
And he had to be hospitalized for that in 69. And, he really became withdrawn. And, this was around the time you'd hear stories of uh, John Lennon or Brian introducing himself to John Lennon multiple times in a row at a party, or Brian working with the Wrecking Crew and forgetting who they were, not recognizing them anymore. And so, this is when you start to hear some of those tough stories about Brian and, the Brian's in bed sort of, era.
Hmm.
But yeah, he still did make some marvelous contributions in this era from you've got the Till I Die and A Day in the Life of a Tree, and you have Carl and Al and Bruce completing Surf's Up from Smile. So Brian's music was still reaching the public and still, giving people joy, even if Brian was less involved in the production itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think two things that contributed to Brian's kind of depressive state around this time when he really started to withdraw from the group was, I know one of the biggest things was when Murray sold Sea of Tunes, the Beach Boys publishing company, I believe in 1969, and that really devastated Brian. He kind of, first off, Murray did it completely unexpectedly. Brian had no heads up that this was going to happen. The band didn't really know, and Murray just took it upon himself to do this, and Brian basically viewed it like Murray was giving up on him, like viewing it like, well, you've done all you can do, so we're just going to sell the rights now, and he sold it for an amount that is pretty outrageous, looking at the group's music that they had put out and how much the band could have made in future years, as a result, if this hadn't happened. But that really devastated Brian. And then I think the other thing too was that, the band's records just weren't selling around this time. You look at like Friends, which like really bombed and was like their worst selling album up to that point. I remember there was a quote from Brian. I think he said something about Sunflower, how he was really disappointed that didn't sell because the group was really proud of that record. And Brian has some great contributions on there with, This Whole World and Add Some Music to Your Day and a lot of really great tracks. So that not selling really hurt them as well. And as Nate mentioned, I've heard that quote as well, about, I believe Bruce specifically was referring to Surf's Up, which they really were selling as a big Brian project because, Surf's Up was on there. When in reality it was really more of the group contributed most of the songs. And then, Brian's tracks were tagged on at the very end. But as Nate said, those songs are incredible. And, Till I Die is another one of my favorite Beach Boys songs. Day in the Life of a Tree is one of the most emotionally moving Beach Boys songs. And then on albums like Carl and the Passions and Holland, while Brian's contributions aren't as obvious and aren't as direct, they're still there, and I still think that they're great. You look at a song like Marcella, which takes fragments of previous Brian songs and puts them together in a really cool way. I know Brian said they were kind of going for a kind of Stonesy sound on that record, kind of a Rolling Stones vibe, which you can definitely hear. And then on Holland, songs like Funky Pretty, which is a really cool track, and Sail on Sailor, which I know, Brian co-wrote with a number of people, including Van Dyke Parks, but that's a
With
really cool
about
track.
25 people.
Yeah, 25 people, right. But yeah, like Nate said, though, Brian's contributions around this time definitely nowhere near as prominent. But he's still there. And, I know he toughed it out and went to the Netherlands with the band to record Holland, even though we didn't really want to be there. So tough time in Brian's life. And unfortunately, it did get even tougher as like got to the mid 70s. And that's really when Brian really started struggling, not only mentally, but also like health wise. But the contributions he did make on these early 70s albums for Warner Reprise are really great. So,
I would say for me, the highlight of that era, I mean, other than like obviously like Till I Die is great, but All I Want to Do on Sunflower
mhm.
is one of the most ahead of its time recordings I have ever heard in my life. If you told me that an indie band put that out in the mid 2000s, I would have totally believed you. And that song came out in 1970. Now, I do know that Brian and Mike wrote that one. I do want to also give a shout out to Carl because I know Carl was very involved with the production on that one. Absolutely gorgeous song. Absolutely amazing song. Also, I want to give a shout out to the EP that was packaged with Holland, the
Mount Vernon Fairway.
Fairway thing. Not the biggest fan of it as a whole, but I do think there are some pieces of it that are very Brian and very charming, like the glowing magic transistor radio, and then of course Pied Piper, I better get back in bed. Definitely very quintessentially Brian. And I know also this was around the time he was doing the Radiant Radish. He did that in the late 60s,
Yeah.
70s. Kind of an interesting thing. Honestly, Brian, some of these like things he picks up, these like fascinations kind of remind me of myself because like I will just get like very interested in something and then I'll like drop it to the side and then I'll pick it up back again like a couple months or years later and I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's why I was into that." So like his little health kick kind of reminds me of some of the things I've gotten into over the years.
I think it's we also forgot to mention Breakaway.
Mm.
Um Easily forgotten song, not because it like isn't good, just because it was a single. That was Brian and Murray working together. Well, I guess Reggie Dunbar. Fantastic song. Maybe one of my favorites in the band. Um, and yeah, I mean, he definitely wasn't as present, but when he was, he had some great moments. I mean, obviously, I think you guys kind of mentioned pretty much all the tracks you could have mentioned with Brian, but you also have the amount of stuff that was locked away in the vaults that he made. Oh my God, I'm going blank.
Well, you have the also the American Spring stuff, which to me
Yeah.
shows that Brian was still he was still passionate about music and like making music. He just didn't necessarily want to be doing it with the Beach Boys, you know?
Right, yeah, I also did stuff with Three Dog Night.
Yep.
But I mean, you go back to like 69 with 2020, and you also have Time to Get Alone.
Yep.
Mm.
Um, and then you have other stuff like on Sunflower that is pretty good. I know you mentioned Tears in the Morning, but you have him finally finishing Cool Cool Water.
Yeah.
Um,
You mean Deirdre? Because you said Tears.
Here-
Cool Cool Water?
No, no, you said Tears in the Morning. That's a Bruce song. Did you mean Deirdre? Because I know Brian had a co-writing credit on Deirdre.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Um, then you have sorry, where was I? And then you obviously have Till I Die,
Yep.
Day in the Life of the Tree.
They finally finished Surfs Up too.
Surf's Up. But I mean, that was kind of more of a Carl project because Carl kind of finished that one up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, he
I
was,
love this story on Cool Cool Water, um, which, like you guys mentioned, is one of those brilliant fragments from the Smile era. And then the guys finished it, and there's this funny story where Bruce took it to play it for the label executives, and he demanded that they turn all the lights off while they played uh, the song so that they could imagine the imagery from the song as they listened. And so off of that, I think they decided to release it as a single, but they had to sort of chop it down and make it a little shorter. But yeah, it gives a great little insight into the brilliance of the Smile material, which of course, no one really knew at the time, whether it was Essence or Surf's Up or Cool Water from Sunflower, that these were Smile fragments, but
Hmm.
I don't think that that was necessarily always disclosed. So, maybe the albums would have sold better had people been more aware that the Smile material was trickling out.
Hmm.
oh, I just forgot to mention them. We also talked about Carl and the Passions, Marcella, banger.
Yep.
I definitely think Ricky and Blondie, whether intentionally or not, kind of brought a little life back into him because there's definitely a different vibe with the band. Um, you have him help him out on Hollands, whether he really wanted to or not. With the Sail on Sailor. Crap, what was the other one?
Funky.
Funky Pretty. Yeah, but
He gave his great little tiny hook on California
California.
Saga, where he came down in the bathrobe
I'm
and
on my way to
improvised
sunny
that and then disappeared
California.
again. Brian
Yeah.
also had a car accident in Holland that was pretty severe.
Hmm.
Um, I think of all the guys, I think Brian probably had the hardest time when they were in Holland. Though I can imagine Mike was wanting to get back to the waves, and Dennis probably wanted to get back to the surfing. But Yeah,
Brian was a guy,
Brian.
he liked being at home, you could tell.
Right,
He never
exactly.
really liked
That's what I
travel.
was. Yeah.
Yeah, he was very much a homebody.
I knew you were going to say that phrase. That's why I didn't say homebody.
You know me too
So,
well.
following Holland and Carl and the Passions, those albums, for as brilliant as they are, they really did not do well commercially, and the band was definitely at a crossroads, and their infighting was starting to reach, a high, but God gave them a stroke of good luck with the release of Endless Summer and Spirit of America, which were compilations of all the brilliant music that Brian produced in the previous decade. And, Endless Summer hit number one and was one of the biggest albums of the 1970s, if not of all time. And it introduced Brian's music to a whole new generation. And then, off the success of that, you've got Spirit of America coming out, which, had some hits, but Spirit of America is almost more of a showcase of a lot of B-sides and album cuts and lesser known songs,
It was their master
such
plan.
as, yeah, such as A Young Man Is Gone, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, you know, um,
Little girl I once
Do You
knew.
Want to Dance? Yeah. And so
Breakaway.
Breakaways on there.
Breakaway, yep. And so that those albums did extremely well, and the Beach Boys became a stadium touring act.
They were
And
Rolling
they
Stones
even,
Band of the Year in '74, I
I was
think.
about to mention that. Yeah,
right,
that was a big deal. They kind of came back from the, I don't want to say they came back from the dead, but more like they kind of were back in the public consciousness. Because like they kind of were like almost becoming a bit of a cult band before.
Mm.
And now it was kind of like, oh, they're back, and I think also too, I think it's also important to mention, I really think that part of that too is the success of American Graffiti. I think the success of American Graffiti kind of led to the packaging of Endless Summer, and I know Mike kind of came in and put it together and came up with the title, and thank God he did because, like you said, it could have been the best of the Beach Boys Volume 27, but it ended up, having a really great title, and it kind of gave them a second wind to their career.
it's really and like you mentioned, it's probably Mike probably bears the most responsibility, but just the way that album was put together and marketed was so brilliant. There had been a gazillion Beach Boy compilations by this point, but the beauty of Endless Summer is that it was really marketed as more of a concept album in a way of just this it starts with the surfing songs, and then you get the romance songs, and it's just a slice of all the different subjects that the Beach Boys sang about. And once again, they were superstars, the biggest band in the world, perhaps. And they were touring with Chicago. And, with all of this Beach Boy mania going on, so to speak, the guys decide to get Brian back on the road with them. And they start this whole Brian's Back campaign. And, maybe this was ill-fated, but we got some incredible music from it. We've got 15 Big Ones, which you guys know is one of my favorite albums, which really brings back the surf vibes and the oldies vibes. And you've got Brian covering Phil Spector again, and then you have the Beach Boys Love You, which is just one of the most personal albums they ever made. So quirky and adorable. And so those are some real highs, 15 Big Ones was a huge commercial success. And on that album, you've got Rock and Roll Music, which was the first single that Brian produced for the band in a long time, and a big, big success. And, so you've got a lot of this great stuff going on. I think Brian was even enjoying being back on the road. Brian was playing bass again and really enjoying that. And Brian would sit on his amp so he could feel the vibration of the bass, and, because one of his ears wasn't hearing. And so you've got all this really cool stuff going on, these victories for Brian. But on the other hand, a very controversial, polarizing, dare I say, dark figure was brought into the Beach Boys' orbit, and that is Eugene Landy. And while on one hand, Landy clearly has to be given credit for saving Brian's life. He also deserves all the condemnation in the world for being incredibly abusive to Brian and separating him from his family and his loved ones. So this era, you know, amazing music, but very, very complicated in Brian's life. He divorces Marilyn, his relationship with his kids, very strained. And even his relationship with his brothers is becoming very strained. So it's how should I put it? Choppy waters at this point in time.
Yeah. It is a very kind of controversial period. Like Nate said, there were some highs. Like there were times when Brian did seem to enjoy being on the road, and like Nate said, some really great music came out of this period. I've made it. I've said multiple times in this podcast, "I Love You" is one of my favorite Beach Boys albums and one of my favorite albums of all time, just because it's just such a personal record, and you just really hear Brian's vulnerability and honesty on that album. And not only do I love the songwriting and the arrangements, but I just love how Brian the album is. It really kind of gives you an idea or like a look into his mind, into his psyche at the time, and like the things that interested him, and just what he wanted to write about. So I really love that record a lot. And I think it's a really innovative album, just the way that the synthesizer is used and the way that, just it's almost in a way an early synth pop album. You look at records like Holland, which, did have like the Moog synthesizer on them, but like Love You is like such a unique and different album. Like there really is nothing from that period or since that really sounds like it. So very unique record. But as Nate alluded to, there was also a lot of controversy during this period and a lot of kind of low points with Brian too. The Brian's Back campaign is controversial because Brian truly wasn't really back. The band kind of pressured him into going on the road with them, even though he was still kind of struggling with some mental health issues. And, there were times, especially early on in the Brian's Back era, where like critics and reviewers who were at these concerts would say, like, Brian does not look happy on stage. He's barely contributing. He looks very uncomfortable. And, if you've seen any videos or photos from that era, there definitely is a lot of truth to that. But obviously, Brian being on stage with them definitely was of interest to fans and definitely sold tickets. But was he truly, really back? Not really. But he certainly did produce some great music during this time, and some really unique songs as well. So yeah, definitely, like Nate said, choppy waters for sure during this period. After Love You, Brian ends up divorcing with Marilyn, so he's no longer with her anymore. There's issues between the band members. Dennis is really starting to drink even more and have his own substance abuse problems. This is a period where Carl kind of hits a low too. I know they had a very disastrous tour in Australia in like 1978 where Carl was really messed up. And then I know around the time of the MIU album, I believe Brian said that, or somebody said that Brian basically had like a mental blank out where it's like he doesn't even really remember anything that the band did around that time, just because like he was at such a low point. He was really depressed. He didn't really want to be involved with it. They had to go to Iowa to record the album, and he just wasn't really interested. So definitely some highs in this period, but also a lot of lows. So I think it's definitely worth acknowledging, that this wasn't the brightest period in Brian's life, despite a lot of the great music that we got from it as well.
For sure. Some highlights from me from 15 Big Ones and Love You, I will point out. It's Okay, I think is a great return.
Oh yeah.
Classic surf rock sound. Had to Phone Ya has a great, which I know that was originally, I think that was an American Spring song, but it was
Yeah.
repurposed Beach Boys song. I really like the melody on it, and I also like that each of the boys kind of get their own piece. But I also think that that was probably a pretty jarring listen in 1976 because that's the first time you got to hear Brian's newer, gruffer voice and also Dennis's newer, gruffer voice. Also on here, let's see, just looking, great covers of Just Once in My Life. Brian does a really good job on that one. On Love You, I know, of course, The Night Was So Young, I'll Bet He's Nice, I think are absolutely stunning pieces of work. I think Honking Down the Highway is a banger. Airplane is a banger. I know that Jake, when we were in Chicago driving in the car, we were listening to Johnny Carson and singing it. That was fun. And then, of course, there's like the famous Ding Dang and everything, which is just, the whole shortening bread and all that. Um, just, yeah. So, definitely what I really appreciate about Love You is it's a quintessentially Brian release.
Mhm.
Definitely, like you feel like it kind of wears its heart on its sleeve for better and for worse. But I really think that at its best, some of the most heartfelt and gorgeous songs he ever wrote. Seriously, I mean, I think, like I said, like I think The Night Was So Young and I'll Bet He's Nice, those two of the finest songs he ever wrote. Absolutely stunning pieces of work. Mona's great too. That's another banger for me, Mona.
Mhm. Yeah, Mona is a banger. Yeah, I've always never been the biggest fan of this era musically, especially 15 Big Ones. Never really got the hype. There's a lot of charm to it for sure, and I do like some of the sounds, but the songwriting really wasn't there. Love You, on the other hand, has grown on me a lot since we've started doing this. Side one, still a bit iffy. I like some of the tracks on it. I love Mona. I've always loved Mona. Solar System is probably never gonna grow on me. Sorry, Jake. Um, but I'll bet he's nice. The Night Was So Young, and especially recently, Let's Put Our Hearts Together has been a really played track from me, especially after the news. And I actually do like Love Is a Woman. I think that's a very charming track. It's very like doo-woppy kind of style, and I love that Mike gets a little lead on it too. But yeah, 78 MIU, just for all its charms, was very weak, especially for compared to what we could have gotten. Adult Child, I again, similar with Smile, I don't think it's one of the greatest things ever, but there are some fantastic tracks from there. Still I Dream of It. Um,
It's over now.
It's Over Now.
Some of the
Deep Purple's a fantastic cover.
Mhm. You got
Um,
catchy songs like "It's Trying to Say" and what's the other one?
Which one is
Life is for the living.
Life is for the Living? Yeah, that one's definitely that one honestly sounds like it could have been on Love You.
Life is
Yeah.
for the Living. Yeah, that's a great. Well, he has a lot of that 40s kind of big band influence on this one, which I really like.
Mhm.
I've always kind of liked On Broadway a little bit. I know that doesn't have the greatest track record. Sherry She Needs Me was finally finished around this time too. I'm a big fan of that one. So there's a lot of great music that Brian was doing. But as with a lot of the Beach Boys material, they kind of chose the wrong tracks. And then when you get to LA, like 79 almost, I mean, I remember when I asked Jeffrey Cushing Murray in her interview, it's like, hey, did you ever really see Brian much? She's like, no, not really. He wasn't really around. Brian kind of secluded himself again after the big Brian's Back campaign. And you kind of see that in the early 80s too. I mean, this is, I think after he separated from Landy the first time, he kind of went right back to where he was, if not worse.
Mm.
Especially when you get to like the cocaine sessions and
As far as like the late 70s, highlights for me on MIU, I do really like My Diane. I think that's an incredible song. I think Pitter Patter is a banger. Match Point of Our Love, I don't like it as much as Jake does, but I do think it is a very nice song. And I kind of like Won't You Come Out Tonight and Sweet Love. Um, so I definitely think there's still some, and Halo Tomboy has a good melody. Lyrics we don't talk about, but I think that there's definitely some decent material on MIU. But like as you said, Riley, I think that they didn't pick necessarily the best stuff. And LA Light, as far as the Brian songs, I mean, Good Timin's great. Here Comes the Night, I don't like that version.
short and bread.
And then Short and Inbred is fine for what it is, but I've never been the biggest fan of it. I know it's like kind of a meme. Like honestly, for me on LA Light, I think the highlights for me are like the Dennis and Carl songs are like the ones. And
Can't
like
forget about Ding Dang on Love You.
Lady, I did mention Ding Dang, and then Lady Linda, of course, is really good on LA Light. But yeah, I
That was
think
Al though. That's more Al
I know
and
it's Al. I know it's Al. I'm just mentioning like if we're just talking about LA Light briefly.
oh, man,
Um,
I think it's a great album, but it's not a Brian heavy album. It's kind
no,
of
it's
more of
not.
a
It,
follow up to Holland more than follow up to like MIU and I guess Love You and stuff.
Yeah, and then like going into the 80s, I think, Brian was kind of like even more so, like kind of sequestering himself. And like you still had some contributions, like I know like on Keeping the Summer Alive, like just looking at the songs he co-wrote, like Oh Darling, Some of Your Love, When Girls Get Together, which I know was old, that kind of had been
Yeah.
kicked around for a bit. Sunshine, which I still have no idea how that song goes. And Going On, which Going On is good. I do like that one.
Going On is a great return to form.
Going On is a great return to form. And then Santa Ana Wins, which I still feel like that's more of an Al song, but
That is an Al song.
it has a Brian
It's
co.
actually musically, as far as the melodies and chords go, was more in Brian. Brian was like the genesis for it, and then I think Al sort of finished the lyrics.
Yeah, I can hear that. But yeah, like you're kind of heading now towards like, especially with the cocaine sessions and all that, you're kind of heading towards like when Brian like the 70s were bad, But the 80s were really bad too
The
because
early 80s, dude, like 82,
like
83,
I
and
know
he's weighing like 300 pounds.
Yeah,
You
you've
have
all seen
those
that picture where
terrifying and like depressing pictures of him.
yeah,
And the
like
crazy thing is he's still making some good music though. Like you have like the cocaine sessions. So you got some, I think Oh Lord is like one of the songs people like, and you also have Stevie, which I'm actually a pretty big fan of. I
yeah.
think that one was finished later on. Like you could see he was still capable of making music, but oh my God, it was just a really terrible time for him.
Yeah, I think you can see, as controversial as Landy was and like, the stuff that he'd go on to do, because I know the second time that Brian was with Landy was far worse than the first because Landy took far more control over his life. But at the same time, you can also understand why at the time the band brought him back in because the reality is like Brian was going to die if they didn't do anything. Like he was, like Riley said, he was like 300 pounds, not well at the time. I believe he was checked into the hospital again multiple times in like the late 70s, as you guys mentioned too, barely really involved with LA. And but yeah, especially like that early 80s period between like 81, 82, like that's really when like Brian's health was really at its worst, and he was just not well. And those cocaine sessions recordings, like they're very haunting because you're hearing a guy who's like just in a really low state, a very low point in his life, recording these songs which are very simple. Like I don't think there's too much to them, but they're also very haunting and very moving. Part of that's like the lo-fi quality of the recording, but also just the fact just knowing what Brian was going through and hearing him sing with his kind of more rougher voice. It's just a very powerful thing to listen to. So tough period in Brian's life, but I'm glad that he got through it. And obviously, as we're going to get into, the 80s were a tough period for Brian as well. But health wise, he did get better during this period. So but yeah, real briefly in terms of Brian's contributions during that time, my favorites would probably be My Diane, Still I Dream of It, and It's Over Now. I think all three of those tracks are just really beautiful, and those are all songs that I think show that Brian's songwriting capabilities were still there around this time, and even on the songs where like he kind of sounds more like he's on autopilot, like on songs like Match Point of Our Love, which I'm sure like Brian probably had no recollection of writing, but like I think that's a really catchy and fun song. So Nate, do you want to kind of talk about, the early 80s where Landy became involved with Brian again, and then kind of Brian's involvement with the band around this time, as well as his first solo efforts?
Yeah, so Landy was brought back into the fold in the early 80s. And I think in the 70s, Landy was obviously polarizing, but there was still enough of a unit of friends and family that had Brian's back. You know, at the beginning, you had Marilyn and you had Stan and Steve Love and Dean Torrance and all these people that sort of stepped up to be there for Brian at this time. And when you get to the 80s, when Brian is reunited with Landy, Landy really secluded Brian from any other support and love. So, by this point, Brian can't even reach his children, can hardly communicate with his band. He's under constant surveillance, video cameras constantly filming him, and you know, the quote unquote surf Nazis always in his presence. So, the 80s were definitely a very, very dark time. And while Brian got physically healthier, at least to the naked eye, he seemed healthier. I would maybe argue that he was in an even worse position, given the hell that Landy was putting him through. So, as the 80s chug on, you've got the Beach Boys 85 album, which Brian makes a few contributions to, but still has a bit of a lighter footprint. And you get to the era of those soundtracks that we talked about with our Still Cruising episode recently, and you get Wipeout, which is actually pretty notable because like last time I said that it was the last top 20 hit that Brian produced and sang lead on. So that's actually, extremely notable. And for Brian to have a hit like that. And so Wipeout came out in 87, and around the exact same time, Brian is working on his solo debut, which we also discussed recently. And he makes his first statement as a solo artist with his self-titled album, Brian Wilson, in 1988. which saw him collaborating with Gary Usher once again, and Russ Titleman, and Jeff Lynne from ELO. So you had a lot of talented people helping Brian with his solo album, and it received a lot of praise when it was released. However, it was almost instantly overshadowed by Brian's band, the Beach Boys, having their first number one hit in eons with Kokomo. Unfortunately, Brian was supposed to sing on Kokomo, but Dr. Landy prevented him from doing so. And so, Brian's solo album got really overshadowed by the Beach Boys' success at this time, which he was unfortunately not really allowed to fully participate in. However, you have the guys going on Full House, which Brian actually did appear on, and that brought a whole new level of attention to the band because Full House was, essentially like a cultural institution at the time. It was one of the biggest shows in the world and would have millions and millions of people watching. So it gave the Beach Boys a whole new level of fame. And so, again, this era can really be summed up as a dichotomy of very high highs and very low lows.
Yeah, very similar to kind of the late 70s where, there's a lot of kind of bad things going on in Brian's life. Kind of around this time, you have that balance as well where, Brian's life is really being controlled by Eugene Landy. Before obviously he was also under his control, but now especially where like Landy is actually weaving his way into being like Brian's like creative partner and also like getting in on his finances as well, so really started to overstep his bounds even more here. I think even around the time of like when Brian's solo album came out in 1988, I think even around that time, kind of the media and like a lot of people were already skeptical, of like Landy's, relationship with Brian and like, cause it's gone way too far, so I think even at the time people were skeptical. Like with the late 70s though, Brian did put out some really great music during this period. Songs like Melt Away and Love and Mercy, I think are highlights of Brian's catalog. Really, really beautiful songs that Brian wrote at a time in his life where there was just a lot of difficult things going on. So, tough period in Brian's life, but we did get some good music out of it. Also, you look at the late 80s, there were also some major lawsuits that Brian was involved with as well. I know he filed a suit against, I believe it was Irving Music, that was over publishing rights. You also had the thing with Mike, which I believe Mike was right to sue in that case because Mike did deserve credits for all the songs he contributed to. But just a lot of difficult things going on around this time in Brian's life. But like Nate said, like I think to the public, looking at Brian, he sounded better, he looked better, but I think like inside, like there was just so much stuff going on with Landy. It really probably was hell a lot of times for Brian during this period.
Yeah, and I think that Love and Mercy did a very good job. The film did a
Yeah.
very of dramatizing that, where you can kind of see just how much control Landy and his goons had over Brian at that point in time. As far as highlights on the solo album, I agree with you. Love and Mercy, Melt Away, Walking the Line, I really enjoy.
Mhm.
Maybe Let Your Hair Grow Long, Meet Me in My Dreams Tonight. There's So Many is a gorgeous track, and then I also really quite like the B side, Being with the One You Love. That was the B side that I remember I'm really enjoying off of Brian Wilson, 88. I also know that in the early 90s, so like around this little couple years later, Brian wrote his first memoir called Wouldn't It Be Nice? And that particular book, I know there's been a lot of debate as to who actually wrote it. I know that
Mhm.
I think that Landy actually wrote it. I know there was a big lawsuit over that book. I want to say, like, I think didn't Carl sue him? I
A
know,
lot of the Beach Boys, yeah, a lot of people in the family sued. Yeah.
and multiple defamation lawsuits from
Yeah.
family associates. Let's see, Mike Love filed a defamation suit. So did Carl Wilson, Brother Records, and Audrey Wilson. So it was a very controversial book. There also was around this time, so this was around the time this book was published, I think is kind of when like I don't know if you guys have seen, I'm sure you all seen it, the interview that Diane Sawyer did with Dr. Landy where she kind of grills the hell out of him.
Hmm.
Kind of was like, and you just kind of like I personally walked away from that thinking like, wow, what an unethical monster.
Yeah.
Especially when you become a doctor, you take an oath that you need to like follow a code of ethics, and he just completely like disregarded that. Basically was mooching off of Brian. And I've always been of the opinion that I think that Landy definitely saved his life, but he also way overstepped and almost formed like I don't even know, some very parasocial relationship. And like the whole thing with like living in his house, and it was just crazy, man.
This
24
Well,
hours.
weird mix between like doctor, manager, co-writer, husband, father. Like, what
Yeah.
the hell?
Like it was just like he way like I mean he violated every code of ethics when you become a doctor.
He lost
yeah,
his license, right?
He did.
yes, yes.
Um, yeah, Nate kind of said it best. Like he looks incredible. Like Brian was very attractive man in the mid to late 80s, but mentally he was just as gone, maybe worse. Not in the same way. He was definitely better with some of that stuff, but he was, like we clearly mentioned, in a very terrible relationship with Dr. Landy. I think it's really funny that Landy took him out of Kokomo, and I bet his like mindset was like, "Oh, Brian can do better on his own. Kokomo's not even going to be that big, and then Kokomo's the number one hit." So then he puts Brian back in with Still Cruising to do in my car, probably just to get some sort of money out of it. I think that's kind of ironic, but yeah,
And
that's
oddly enough, Brian's on the Spanish version of Kokomo, but
yeah.
not
He
the
wanted to get
hit
in there as
version.
soon as possible.
Yeah.
Um,
I totally forgot that there was even a Spanish version of Kokomo until you mentioned. I know I've definitely heard it because it was on one of those endless bummer things, but I totally forgot that was even a thing.
but there was still great music to be had. Obviously, you have Love and Mercy, Walk on the Line. There's so many, Melt Away. A lot of the tracks that he, not a lot, actually, yeah, I'd say a lot of the tracks he did with Gary Usher were pretty solid. I mean, it's said that Brian wrote like 60 to 80 songs between like 84 and 88. A lot with Gary Usher. Unfortunately, he was kind of taken away from Gary Usher by Landy.
And then
Starts
canceled.
working with I was going to say Russ Titleman. He did work with Russ Titleman, but then he also starts working with Andy Paley. And then you kind of get into like 89, 90. You kind of get what was going to be his follow-up, Sweet Insanity. You get some pretty solid tracks there. I really like that synth-heavy version of Don't Let Her Know She's an Angel. I think that
Mhm.
version slaps. But that kind of starts to fumble once the whole Landy thing like started to end and he got separated because Carl really stepped in and helped him out there, which was awesome.
Oh, and I also Let's Go to Heaven in My Car. That's a good one that he did
How
with
could I forget? How could I forget that one? That was a freaking banger.
that is a banger. I did want to say too that that is one. If there's one big gripe I had with the Love and Mercy movie, it did downplay the role that Carl had in helping
Yeah.
Brian free of Landy. That is my one major gripe I have with that film. Otherwise, I think it's a very well done film.
Yeah. It's also worth mentioning around this time, we already talked about Brian getting back with Gary Usher, which unfortunately, I think there's some parallels kind of to how like Murray kind of didn't want, Brian working with Gary Usher because he was kind of getting jealous. He's like, no, you're not going to write with Gary. Kind of had that again with, with Landy separating Brian from Usher. But you also look at like in the early 90s, Brian collaborating with Van Dyke Parks again with Orange Crate Art. And then in the late 1990s, Brian and Tony Asher collaborated again, did the song "Everything I Need," and I believe maybe one other song as well. So, pretty cool that like Brian kind of was able to kind of rekindle his relationship with some of the people that he worked with in the '60s. So,
Yeah,
Mm.
and then you get to like the mid 90s, and even though Summer in Paradise happened, I do like some tracks on it, but we'll get to that next week, I'm sure. Um, there was gonna be wasn't there gonna be a Beach Boys album like the mid 90s? There's gonna be like Brian's kind of return to the band. You had him doing a lot of stuff with Andy Paley. You had Soul Searching.
yeah,
Uh,
Don Wise.
yeah, you have a lot of tracks that were like kind of
Or
in the works.
Mystery or
And
whatever.
unfortunately, it never really culminated to anything. But I feel like there could have been something cool there.
Yeah. So apparently what happened with that was I think Carl was not thrilled with that material um for whatever reason. And I think that's kind of why it didn't get released at the time, but Soul Searching I think is incredible. I think it's You're Still a Mystery. That's a really good one too. What I was going to say was also I think in the mid 90s there was talks of Brian finally completing Smile, but I think Carl didn't want to go there because he was afraid it would trigger another mental breakdown. Um so yeah, and I know that there was also we had Stars and Stripes Volume 1,
Oh
which
yeah.
I do believe Brian had a co-writing credit on. How much he actually produced of it, I'm not too sure because I know that Well, of course, we haven't talked about her, but around this time too, Brian got married to Melinda Ledbetter, who we know was covered in Love and Mercy. Obviously, tells the story of their romance and relationship. She claims that Brian was treated like an invalid producing this album. So I don't really know how much credit. I don't know how much Brian actually produced Stars Stars Volume One. I will be completely honest. I've never listened to it. I have no interest in listening to it. I don't care for country music very much, and I don't need to hear them cover classic Beach Boys songs. So I'm just being real. Just
The Willie Nelson version of More Than the Sun. That's
I'll
good.
probably listen to that, but like I'm not a big country music guy. I never have been. It has always been and always will be my least favorite genre of music.
Yeah.
I actually think that album has a ton of merit. And to me, the fact that the Beach Boys are mainly backup vocalists is nothing new because so they also were on Pet Sounds as well, you know? Um, and I think, the album has a lot of merit, even for just alone being Brian's return to producing the Beach Boys. I think for everything after the 90s, it's Brian always had co-producers and after during his solo career and his stuff with the Beach Boys, Joe Thomas, Scott Bennett. I think with Brian's mental health and all of his struggles, I don't think Brian was really up to the task of being the sole producer on albums, and he always needed someone to help him get things to the finish line once you get to this point. But yeah, Stars and Stripes actually did remarkably well. It was like a top 10 album on several country charts and sold quite well. And it got the band back on the talk shows, and they had their documentary about the making of the album. And what I love about that documentary, what's it called? Nashville Sounds, which was about the making of Stars and Stripes, is Brian looks really happy in that film. And there's a lot of moments of him joking around with Mike and sitting at the mixing board and giving his directions to the singers. So I do suggest for anyone that questions Brian's involvement or the validity of that album to check out the Nashville Sounds movie because it totally made me appreciate the album a lot more. And like I mentioned, you got Joe Thomas producing with Brian on that album, and that really opens the door for Brian's solo career as we've known it since 1998, because you have Brian working with Joe on Imagination, which was really his reintroduction to the world as a solo artist. And it coincided with him becoming a touring artist under his own name, which is something that no one could have ever expected. People thought that Brian wouldn't even last the whole show on his first solo date in the 90s, let alone continue to tour until 2022. So to me, when you get to the late 90s, early 2000s, is really like when a weight is lifted off Brian's shoulders and you can just take a deep breath as a fan and just witness Brian in probably the happiest place of his life since the early 60s, adopting children with Melinda and releasing a lot of great solo stuff from, Imagination and the Pet Sounds live and That Lucky Old Sun and completing Smile. So really, this is like Brian's victory lap. After decades of challenges, you get to the late 90s and 2000s, which is just a really beautiful time in his life.
Yeah, and we got a lot of really great music. Even after even after Brian's first solo albums. You look at That Lucky Old Sun, songs like Midnight's Another Day and Southern California. Those are really really beautiful songs, very moving, especially now. That Brian has passed. Re-listening to those very emotional songs. And like Nate said, like this is a very crucial period in his life because it really did launch his solo career, his solo touring career, going on the road with guys like Jeff Foskett and Darian and guys that would be with Brian for many years. So definitely a very, kind of a better point in his life, after years of struggle with Landy and with, all the drugs earlier on, so finally a period where, like Nate said, he seemed to be in a happier place. And I think it was really great for him too to see like people really coming out to support him and appreciate his music. I know like when he did the Pet Sounds tour in the early 2000s, he sold out shows in Europe for that. So I'm sure that that really meant a lot to Brian, to have thousands of people at the venues each night, supporting him and wanting to hear these amazing songs that he wrote, decades earlier. So, really cool. And, Brian's solo touring career, I'm just really thankful that I had the opportunity to see him. I mean, like Nate said, it's amazing that he did tour for as long as he did. I think, knowing everything that Brian had went through, it really is remarkable that he was on the road for pretty much like 2 decades as a solo touring artist. And, his concerts were an experience, whether or not, Brian was always fully into it, in the latter years of his touring life. Just hearing these songs, performed by such an incredible band, really bringing the studio recordings to life on stage, and then hearing the guy that wrote them sing them, it really is a really incredible experience. So something I'll always be thankful for. And, I think it was a good thing for Brian to be on the road. I know that there's a lot of people that kind of question, like, was Brian truly happy out there? But he's been quoted multiple times saying, like, I'd rather be out here on the road singing these songs than, sitting at home, not doing anything. I think that it was something to kind of keep his mind sharp and something for him to look forward to. So,
Yeah. Um, Brian Wilson Presents Smile, I think, is the closest we ever got to a finished Smile. And I know that the Smile Sessions was based off of that. So, and I think Darian had a big hand, and also the big back,
Absolutely.
they had a big hand in like helping get that together. And I know that the Smile concerts that Brian did in the mid 2000s were extremely well received. I think Paul McCartney even went to one of them. And there's certain parts of that that I really like. Like I like the I Want to Be Around. That's not on like the Smile Sessions. And I like stuff like that, and In Blue Hawaii and all that, and On a Holiday. I am a big fan of That Lucky Old Sun. I think that might be my favorite Brian solo album. I really love that record. Um, Kind of similar in like it's kind of like Smile where it has like the movements. But I think what I like about it is it's very melodic, and I like that it kind of paints the picture of Brian Wilson's California. I think that, you know, California is one of those states that always has kind of had this like idealized image of like being like the promised land and like, the place of dreams. And I think it's just really interesting to kind of hear Brian and Van Dyke and company just kind of like paint that picture. Things like Mexican Girl and California Roll and, all that. It's such a wonderful record. And I also did see Brian, and I have my ticket pulled up here. I saw him at the Ruth Eckerd Hall in Clearwater, Florida
Mhm.
on November 10th, 2018. So I'm very grateful for that experience as well. This was actually one of the Pet Sounds tours. I think one of the last Pet Sounds shows he did, because I think that 2019 he did the tour with the Zombies. So I'm very grateful that I was able to experience that as well. Something I'll always be grateful for.
I never got to see Brian live, which sucks like a lot. But I had a couple of opportunities like when I was really getting into the band. But even then I kind of knew that he at that point, like 2020, 2021, I guess probably 2022 was probably the first time I probably would have been able to actually see him. I don't think he really wanted to tour anymore. I think he finally had that part of his life finished, and I think he finally needed that chance to relax. But I do remember watching the Smile 2004 like making of kind of thing with the tour and the actual album, and it kind of referenced the talked about the 60s for like the first half hour.
The
And then you
Beautiful
see like
Dreamer
the
movie.
yeah, you see the tour, and you see Brian. He's like, I'm really nervous to go out there. I'm really nervous to go out there. But then you kind of have that kind of quote that Brian said a couple times. He's like, I'm really nervous, but after I get past that first song, I have a lot of fun. You see lots of pictures from like the 2000s, early to mid 2000s, where you see him on stage smiling a lot. He's having a great time. I think when he did a Glastonbury, I think in 2004, 2005, he looked like he was having a lot of fun out there. He seemed really happy on stage, just sing California Girls and some of the stuff from Smile, and just seeing him at that point in his life where he finally found peace and he has like a big smile on his face is something that never fails to make me feel good. So,
yeah.
Yeah, and the later on in the 2000s, you saw Brian reunite with his fellow Beach Boys, and they gave us one last studio album as a group. and a world tour for a little less than a year. And that album gave us some real gems such as Summer's Gone and Isn't It Time and That's Why God Made the Radio. So yeah, that was just a perfect way to um, sort of put a bow on things as far as the Beach Boys' legacy as a studio act. Of course, Mike would go on to continue the Beach Boys touring band, but at least as far as their recording output goes, that was the final piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. And some really moving songs, from Brian on there, like From There to Back Again, which is one of my favorite Beach Boys songs, like from like the 80s onward. I think that's just an absolutely beautiful song with a really great vocal from Al. And then Summer's Gone, that whole suite, where you have Pacific Coast Highway and From There to Back Again, and then Summer's Gone. Like those songs are all really moving, especially again now that Brian has passed. And they're very emotional to listen to. I actually haven't listened to Summer's Gone since Brian passed, but I imagine, the first time that I do, it's probably going to get to me just because that is a very moving song. And, when I've listened to that song in the past, I've thought about, how, all the members are up there now in age and like, these guys aren't going to be around forever. And I think that that song is really moving and just really powerful. So I think that was a really, like Nate said, a really kind of fitting way to close out their recording career, and really cool that the guys did one more tour together as well. I was, really young at the time, so like I wasn't into the band, but I wish I had gone to see that, since it was the last tour and everything. But really remarkable that at that age, the guys went out and did a world tour and played so many of their songs. It was really almost like a career. They pretty much represented most of their career with those concerts. They were playing songs from the 60s and the 70s and deep cuts like All This Is That and Add Some Music to Your Day. So just really cool that the band went out and did that, for all the fans. So
Yeah, I can't say I listen to it much. In fact, I think it's one of my least listened to albums from the group. I think in our first episode or second one, I think I said I liked the production. I think I was confusing it for a different record.
yeah,
Because the production's kind of terrible.
Yeah.
But I think the songs are great. And that last suite of songs is very beautiful.
Mhm.
We get some sort of mix out there. I don't know how possible it would be to get like a different mix of it, but they still had it. Brian still had it. So
Yeah. One additional thing I wanted to mention, in terms of Brian's, late latter day recorded output, one of his last, I believe, maybe his last official like solo release, At My Piano, which is like instrumental versions of a lot of his ballads and a lot of his popular songs that he wrote over the years. I think that that's a very, I know there's some controversy with that album over like, oh, did Brian actually play the parts? I believe that he did. Maybe there was a little bit of
100%.
tuning afterwards, but I believe Brian did put down the core parts. But I find that album very moving as well. Like hearing these songs kind of like stripped back, songs like Till I Die and God Only Knows, and just, listening to the chords, and just hearing like how beautiful these songs are at their core without all the extra production, which, adds a lot to them. But, I've said before, like albums like Love You, which like some fans struggle with, I've listened to piano covers of these songs where like you're only kind of hearing the chords and like really makes you appreciate the songwriting behind these songs. And just like, Brian, his talent as a composer, so I think that album is definitely worth checking out. It's not one that I come back to too frequently, but just hearing those stripped back arrangements is very neat. So
I think they re-released it the other day.
did they really? Oh, I didn't see
I
that.
think so, yeah. And I also really like that Gershwin album he did. I don't really come back to it much, but there is one song on it that I do love. It's The Like and I Love You.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Such a good
Yeah.
song.
I like the cover of I've Got a Crush on You on there too. I think that's very charming. So
He also had his Disney album, which is another, when you think of California, that's another place I think of.
I'd like to point out too that Brian's, at the really the tail end of his life, his story was told not in one movie, but two movies. First with that Long Promised Road movie that came out in 2019 that was put together by Brent Wilson and Jason Fine, which was a very emotional, personal movie that dealt with a lot of Brian's demons and difficulties. And then in 2024, we got the Beach Boys Disney documentary on Disney Plus, and that also went to theaters briefly. That was sort of the yin to the yang of Long Promised Road, whereas Long Promised Road was mostly about Brian's solo career and some of his mental health struggles. The Disney Plus movie was like a celebration of the Beach Boys' heyday and their 60s career and Brian's achievements in the studio. So those movies told his story very well with lots of great color and editing and sound quality. And then we had some books on Brian's life as well. We had Brian's his second autobiography, which most historians consider to be more on the money, which he released in 2017. And then Brian also contributed and was interviewed for the Beach Boys by the Beach Boys book, which came out sort of as a pair with the Disney movie. And so at the end of Brian's life, his story had been told so many times in tabloids and he said, she said type things and all these kind of tales from other rock stars, which could sometimes be a little dismissive or condescending. So it's really nice that at the end of Brian's story, he got to have his story told the way he wanted and the way that he saw. And he got to reunite with his bandmates one last time in 2023 at Paradise Cove, where it all started. And the boys in their 80s got to sing together on the beach one last time. And even as recently as a couple weeks ago, at the time that we're recording this, Mike went to visit Brian, and Mike and Brian sang together, and they sang "Their Hearts Were Full of Spring" and "Fun, Fun, Fun." And just to think that, like at the very beginning of this episode, I mentioned that Mike's earliest memory of his cousin and partner was singing, singing on his grandma's lap and singing together at Christmas parties. So it's just so touching that 60 plus years later, Mike's last memory of Brian is also them singing together. So they started singing together as toddlers and continued singing together until their 80s. And I think that is just such a touching uh, closing to the amazing story of Brian Wilson. He started walking home from school singing Everly Brothers with his cousin Mike, and then all these decades later, got one last chance to hang out and sing with Mike, who's practically the last person Brian has left from his childhood. So very touching.
Yeah. I know.
Really? Oh, what?
Oh, no, I was going to say, I know Al also recently visited with Brian within the past month or two. And I remember he said in the article I read that when he first, saw Brian, when he stopped by, Brian was like, "You started the band," like in like, his usual kind of like abrupt, way. And I just thought that was really funny, but also heartwarming, just the fact that like after all these years, Brian still remembers like the day that, they kind of decided, hey, we should start a band, and I just think that that's really a touching thing, that if after all those years, 80 years later, or 70 years later, Brian still remembered that. So,
That's yeah, that's a good point. I remember like in the book, I mean Jim Murphy, the book I read about from him as like a he said that like Al, it was kind of like a passing comment between Al and Brian when they graduated high school. It was like, hey, we should start a group. And then like a year and a half later, they actually did. And I know it's really heartwarming because I like that's like something that you probably say with somebody when you leave high school. You're like, oh yeah, we should hang out sometime, and then you just never see them again. Uh,
mhm.
but like they actually did, and obviously they had a long history.
All right. So before we wrap up this episode, I just wanted to take a chance for each of us to share 10 of our favorite songs that Brian has written over the years. These can be songs with the group, these can be solo songs, just anything that Brian played a role in writing. We can each just share these one by one if you guys want and just give some really brief thoughts on them each. Do you guys any of you want to start with that?
Um, so for my list, I kind of broke it up based off of like I guess eras,
Mhm.
quote unquote, in the sense that like I tried to pick a mix of like different periods. So the first one I had was In My Room. I just think that that is a really gorgeous song. I think it's one of those songs that is extremely heartwarming. It is extremely emotional. It's something that I relate to a lot. And just the little touches of like the three brothers coming in, the harp, the harmonies. Just a beautiful song.
I'll go with a song from. I also kind of divided mine up into different eras. I'll start off with a song from also from Surfer Girl, "Your Summer Dream." I think it's an absolutely beautiful ballad, one that often gets overlooked. I don't think too many people know this one outside of the Beach Boys like fan base, but really gorgeous song. I love the very stripped back arrangement of it, where it's just Brian's vocal and the guitar. Just a very moving song and one that definitely hits a lot harder now after Brian has passed. Just the very melancholic lyrics of the song and kind of talking about something that's moved on. That's passed on. It's make it real your summer dream. So, very moving track.
I didn't really do eras. I kind of have a flat but also easily changeable top 10. It's actually was a lot harder than I thought it would be.
Mhm.
Three honorable mentions really quick. Till I Die, Don't Worry Baby, and California Girls.
Mhm.
Um, I was gonna say Your Summer Dream, but everything Jake said I could probably just easily throw out there. So you know what? I will go with one of my honorable mentions. I'll go with Don't Worry Baby. It's one of the first songs I really got into with the band. I just think it's really gorgeous. I love the harmonies on it. I didn't even know it was a song about cars till I looked at the lyrics like a year ago. I kind of just thought it was a really sweet song about like a girlfriend and a boyfriend in like the early 60s. And it's just super gorgeous. Very lush song.
So like Jake and Matt, I did mine roughly chronological, and for me it would be really difficult to pick favorites because I love all of his songs so dearly. So I just tried to pick ones that I feel like were milestones or important moments or ones that are evocative of a greater theme. So my first choice was Surfin', just because this song, just right off the bat, has all the magic of the Beach Boys, from Brian's clever arranging and the way that Brian put the harmonies together to his and Mike's lyrics that just paint a really neat image of Southern California, to the way that Brian and his brothers played the instruments. It just has all the magic right off the jump. So I had to include Surfing because I think it's just such a charming record and just has that Beach Boy magic right from the beginning.
So the next one I had on my list was Don't Worry Baby. I know Riley already talked about that one, so I'll be really brief about that one. I think it's a great homage to Be My Baby, which as we all know is was Brian's favorite song of all time. Um, I think that I kind of like how it's like one of those songs that it's like, yes, it is technically about a car, but I think it's also a great love song. Beautifully produced, beautifully sung by Brian, great harmonies, and then I also really like the bridge with the guitar solo, like the guitar solo in the bridge. Just such a beautiful song, and I think that with I Get Around, you could make a case for being one of the greatest 45s ever in the history of
I think it is, man.
popular music.
My next song is a song from today. Please Let Me Wonder. Just an abs. Sorry, Riley. Just such a beautiful ballad. One of my favorite songs of all time. Honestly, it's just so gorgeous. I love the lyrics. A very heartfelt and moving lyric. Kind of. I know Matt kind of described it earlier, but kind of describing kind of the feeling of like wondering if a girl is thinking about you or do you really love me. So I think it's a very moving song. Love the production. The songwriting is great. And it's one of the first like kind of deeper cuts in the band's catalog that I remember hearing and just being really like blown away by it. Just like this is such an amazing song, and it really led me to discover a lot of the band's other music and get as into them as I am today. So
It's not spoiling anything because I said it earlier in the episode. Please let me wonder was going to be my number one tonight. So thanks, Jake. But I will go with another Today track that I have at I think whatever this is, number nine. She Knows Me Too Well. Easily one of the most mature songs Brian ever wrote. I know Mike also wrote the lyrics, but like that collaborate, like that is, it sounds like a Beach Boys song, but like once you look into it, it does not sound like a Beach Boys song at all. It's a very deep song. I just love how like nostalgic and like sad and almost depressing it is, but like you also got like bells in the back and you got like a really neat rhythm going on in the background. It's just a very creative and sad, but also just mature and just beautifully written ballad. I love the progression of it.
Yeah, the vocals on that one are so haunting. I love the vocals on She Knows Me Too.
My next selection is Surf City by Jane and Dean, which we already discussed during the episode, so I don't have to go into it too much more. But I love, love, love Brian and Jan's chord selection on this song. The chords are just very inventive, very colorful. And, to me, whereas Surfin' represents the beginning of Brian's journey, to me, Surf City represents him becoming a mainstay in the industry and one of the titans of the music business. So I just had to include that as a monumental moment in Brian's career, as well as a timeless song. On the subject of Surf City, actually, today or no, I think yesterday, Dean Torrance posted an event in Surf City, which is Huntington Beach, California, and they had all the surfers like paddle out, hundreds of surfers, in honor of Brian, this big surfing event, and Dean was involved in putting that together. So how remarkable that let's see, 62 years after Brian and Jane and Dean made Surf City, Dean was able to honor Brian in what is now officially referred to as Surf City, California. So so remarkable.
Well, I had Please Let Me Wonder. I'll pick something else from today. I'll go with In the Back of My Mind. I think that that is a very moving song. I think the backing track on that song is absolutely incredible. I think there's so much going on in it. It's so dense, but it's just so gorgeously arranged, and I love Dennis's vocal on it. It's a very emotional, heartfelt vocal, and I also think it's another song that kind of touches on some of the anxiety you have when you're in love with somebody. It's like, she gonna stay with me, you know?
Yeah, that was my next one actually because I absolutely love that song too. I think it's just such a melancholic and beautiful ballad. So I will go for a song from the following album, Summer Days and Summer Nights. Let 'Em Run Wild. Just really, really beautiful song. Love the backing track on this one. This is probably like maybe my favorite Brian backing track. I think it's just absolutely beautiful. But again, just a really gorgeous ballad or mid-tempo song, and love Brian's vocal. I know that he's been self-critical of it, but I think it's a really great vocal, and I really love the lyrics on this one too. And especially the part two. After the chorus where they go, "Guess you know I've waited for you, girl." I just think that that sounds just really, really beautiful. So. Love Let 'Em Run Wild. It's one of the highlights of the band's 60s catalog for me.
All right, I'm gonna break into 67 with Heroes and Villains. I think I've always preferred this one over Good Vibrations because of Fantastic Mr. Fox. Um, but I don't know, this song just makes me so happy. I like not in the way that like Surf City might or like Surfing USA or fuck it, even Stoked might make me like pumped. This song just makes me like happy. It just has that vibe to it, like cowboy riding in the West. Nostalgic, not in the way like with Please Let Me Wonder or like I Get Around as makes me like, oh, I'm a kid. It's like nostalgic and like I don't know, like in a different way. I love the different sections of it. I love the feel, the vibe to it. I hate using the word vibe because I feel like I just sound like somebody of my age, which I guess really isn't such a crime, but like I just hate that word. But there's no other word to describe it. There's just this factor to the song, and I feel like the sections works better than Good Vibrations because it almost feels like it's telling a story. Like Nate related Rio Grande to like a Disneyland ride, but I feel like this is like that, but like on steroids. And I just love all the vocal harmonies. They're very creative and very inventive. I love Heroes and Villains. So
My next choice is Be True to Your School, which is such a classic. And to me, it sort of shows Brian writing about, well, let me put it this way. With the first two albums, the songs were very specifically about like the surfing niche and going to the beach. But when you get to Be True to Your School, it's sort of Brian expanding the Overton window of what he was willing to write about. And the songs become more just about the American experience as opposed to the surfer's experience. And so, yeah, to me, Be True to Your School is an amazing example of Brian combining these simple themes that we can all relate to, but with this gorgeous, ornate music. So, yeah, Be True to Your School. It's always been one that I love because my mom showed it to me when I was very young, and it's one of her favorites. So, yeah, just a very, very happy, sweet song.
Does that mean by default that Be True to Your Bud's also on your list?
Sure, if you want to look at it that way, then hell yeah.
And my lifelong love of Budweiser, right, Nate?
Yes, because Nate drinks a lot.
Oh yeah.
Matt, number four.
Well, I had Let 'Em Run Wild, so you talked about it, so I'll pick something else. I'm Waiting for the Day off of Pet Sounds. I love like the contrast between like the big timpani intro and then you have like with like the woodwind instruments and everything coming in and it's one of those songs that I think is very hopeful but also has that tinge of melancholy. And I think that not only do the lyrics reflect that, but I think the music kind of reflects that. And then I also love the outro. Like, you didn't think, no, da 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 da. Yeah, just really, really have always really enjoyed that song. That's one of my favorite. I don't know if I really Pet Sounds has any quote unquote deep cuts because I just think the album is relatively well known. But that's one of I guess that's one of my favorite non-single tracks on Pet Sounds.
So I'm also gonna go with the song from Pet Sounds, one of my favorite songs in the band's entire catalog. Don't talk, put your head on my shoulder. Such a beautiful and moving song. Really love the arrangement on this one, with the strings and I believe the timpani drums on this one as well. Just really, really gorgeous track. Love Brian's vocal, and just the lyric. Just kind of about the feeling of kind of like love without words. Just expressing your love with somebody. Like, don't talk, put your head on my shoulder. Don't talk, close your eyes and be still. I just love the lyric to this one. So beautiful song, always has really moved me, and it's one of the songs in the band's catalog I come back to the most. Just one of my favorite songs of all time. So
We mentioned this one earlier in the episode, All Summer Long from All Summer Long. I don't know, this was always kind of like a sleeper song for me. I don't really listen to it too much, but every time I do, I'm reminded of how much I actually love it. I found it in American Graffiti is like one of the first tracks I remember. Because I think I watched American Graffiti actually before like regular show, and like I knew this song and I really liked it. But I didn't really know it was a Beach Boys song. I just kind of knew it was a song. But when I re-listened to it, like when I really got into the band, I was like, oh yeah, that's that song from that movie. And it's I don't know, and that one just makes me truly enjoy just living and being around in warm weather. Like I know that's really corny and kind of like the point of the song, but it just really rings true. And it just makes me so happy. And the lyrics are so like mundane. Like I remember sitting outside your in the car outside your house and like I spilled like soda all over you. And it's like on paper that shouldn't really work for a song. Like that sounds really stupid, but only the Beach Boys could do it. And it just kind of makes everyday things that you do, like hanging out with your friends, into music form. And it's just pure joy. So I really like that one.
My next pick is one that I chose to showcase Brian's immaculate vocal arranging skills. And it's definitely a very deep cut B-side that I'm not sure very many fans have heard, but it's one of their most gorgeous recordings ever. And that is Brian's arrangement of the Lord's Prayer,
Ooh.
which was the B-side of Little Saint Nick. And there's a great story of Bill Medley from the Righteous Brothers. They were playing a show with the Beach Boys, and Bill Medley produced a lot of the B-sides on those Phil Spector Righteous Brothers albums and singles. And so Brian really respected Bill Medley's input as a musician, and Brian asked Bill if he could get some advice on this thing he was working on. And Bill said, "Yeah, sure." And Bill goes back and listens to the Beach Boys sing their a cappella version of the Lord's Prayer. And he said he was just so stunned. Obviously, didn't have any notes to give or any pointers. But yeah, I think that's just such a gorgeous recording. And if anyone hasn't heard it, I highly recommend you check it out.
So my next choice is another one from Pet Sounds. My opinion, one of the greatest songs ever written. God only knows. First of all, I think the fact that it opens with "I may not always love you," I think is really something because like I can't think of too many love songs that kind of have that in there. Um, the arrangement of the track is just incredible. Carl sings it absolutely amazingly. I think that that was one of the most selfless things that Brian ever did was giving that to Carl because I think Carl gave a tenderness to it that I don't think too many people could have captured. Love the like instrumentation like in the bridge, like the boom, 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 like that little middle part, and then of course the ooh, ah, da, ba, 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 ba. And then of course the perpetual rounds at the end. The God only knows, ba ba ba. And the fact that that song was only written in 45 minutes is just incredible. I mean, I wish I could write a song like that in 45 minutes. I couldn't
Yeah, I
write.
wish I could write a song like that.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't write a song like that in 45 years. Um, one of the greatest love songs of all time, one of the greatest songs period of all time, an absolute masterpiece.
I'm gonna also go with another song from Pet Sounds, the album Closer, Caroline No. One of Brian's greatest ballads, in my opinion. Just absolutely beautiful, really heartbreaking. Again, love the lyrics on this one. Break my heart. I want to go and cry. It's so sad to watch a sweet thing die. Just amazing lyrics from Tony Asher and really gets the feeling of the song across with the words. So, really heartbreaking song, and I think it's a really fitting closer to the album. And I also love the way how it ends with the dogs barking and the train. I think it's a very kind of fitting way to close out the record, considering how emotional of an album it is. So,
Skipping ahead to 1970. This one was technically written in 1969, but whatever. All I Want to Do. I'm sure you guys are going to mention it too on your list somewhere. I would not be shocked if Jake has it. You just kind of have to put it on here. I mean, Brian, like we mentioned with some of like the MIU stuff and a lot of that, like Brian probably just like wrote this like just casually. Um, and like probably doesn't have a story with it. Like you can look at Fun Fun Fun, like him and Mike wrote that in the back of the car, or like even like some of the Pet Sounds one. Like I collaborated with Tony Asher, and we sat on my piano like all night. There's nothing really on this one. It just kind of drops, and it's incredible. And I mean, I think a lot of the credit definitely goes to Carl for the production. So maybe it is unfair to put this on this Brian list, but it's still a Brian Wilson song. And like even if you listen to like the 69 version that almost dropped on 2020, like it's still a well composed song. And
mhm.
it's just very impressive.
Yeah.
My next selection is Shut Down. I think it's just I love the way that to me the music feels just as competitive and kind of macho as the lyrics do. And I love even like the car revving sound effects and Carl and David's great surf guitar. I think it really encapsulates the core elements of the Beach Boys car songs. And oh, and how could I forget that amazing virtuosic saxophone solo as well. And also Brian's bass playing on Shutdown is killer too. Great walking line. So yeah, I think Shutdown just so much energy, great harmonies. So yeah, really fun song.
My next pick is Wonderful, particularly the Smile version. I think it's a beautiful chamber pop song. I think Brian sings it extremely well. The backing track with the French horn or the trumpet and the harpsichord, just absolutely gorgeous. And I also really like the dichotomy of the song because it's this very beautiful sounding, like just amazing song about a young girl who's like losing her virginity. And it's just like kind of like interesting because you don't really think of like the Beach Boys writing songs like that, but I just think that like just like they do it in a way that's so like dichotomy. Like it's just beautiful. Love that song.
My next song is a song from the Surf's Up album, Till I Die. Just a really powerful song from Brian. The lyrics are very relatable to anybody that's dealt with depression in their life. I know that I certainly have gone through periods of time where I really, really connected with this song lyrically. Simple lyrics, but really great lyrics from Brian. And I know some people, Brian a lot of times say that his best lyrics are when he was working with collaborators. But in this case, I think this is an example of a song where Brian's words are really, really strong, and show that he could be a really great lyricist by himself as well. So really moving track, and one of the highlights of the band's 70s catalog for me. I think this is an absolutely beautiful song, but also a devastating song too.
Speaking of beautiful and devastating, I have one from Shutdown Volume 2, The Warmth of the Sun.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Again, kind of a sleeper pick for me because I don't listen to it a lot, but every time I do, it's like, wow. First of all, just the chord change in general, like the general chord change. He kind of, if you know anything about music, he kind of tricks you out. Um, and he kind of takes what was no a normal, average, overly used chord progression around the time, and he just like, once he gets to that third chord, it's like, I couldn't tell you what it is off the top of my head. Nate would probably
E
know.
flat.
Thank you. It just, I think it's C to A minor to E flat. And it's just
Yep.
like, what the fuck? It shouldn't work, but it does. And then on top of that, you have beautiful harmonies. I think maybe one of Mike's greatest set of lyrics. Um, and he wrote this in 1963. And I think this was I think if you were to pick a stepping stone, like this is the one that made him go from Surfing USA, Surfer Girl to Pet Sounds.
Speaking of beautiful and devastating, my next selection is Barbara Ann. But just kidding about the devastating. But maybe to some people's ears, maybe it was. But for me, even though Brian didn't write Barbara Ann, uh, well, I already discussed how much I think the production is so creative and innovative. But even aside from the technical aspects of the song, I think that Barbara Ann just represents that carefree, fun feeling that the Beach Boys represent. For me, it's impossible to hear this song and not smile and not kind of laugh along to the Beach Boys enjoying that recording session. So, of course, since I'm a Jane and Dean fan too, it's fun to hear them singing together. But yeah, I just Barbara Ann is also one song that comes to mind when I think about all the happy memories of seeing both Brian solo and seeing the Beach Boys on the road, because that's always a highlight of the evening where everyone's up and dancing. And even I have memories of Brian playing his bass on Barbara Ann at the encores of some of his shows that I saw. So yeah, I just had to include that one.
I'm gonna pick something from 2020, Time to Get Alone. I first of all, it's one of Brian's many waltzes. It has this like very like light, airy feel to it. Carl sings it really well, and I really like the lyrics because they're like one of those like songs that are very descriptive, and you can almost kind of like imagine it, like the pine scented air smells so good in the snow, and our toboggan will go screaming down the mountainside. And of course, I have to give a highlight to probably the best part of the song, looking down through the valley so deep and wide, and just like how the song just gets all loud all of a sudden. And then, of course, like, aren't you glad we finally got away? I mean, just that whole bridge section.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really, really pretty song, and it's just like I said, it's just like so like light and airy, and just a fun time.
The seventh song on my list is "The Night Was So Young" from Love You. This is just an absolutely gorgeous ballad. I know I've said that about a lot of these songs, but it's true. They're all just really beautiful. And again, love the simple lyrics on this one. Like, it's 3 o'clock. I go to my sink. I pour some milk and I start to think. It's just really effective and moving. And I also just love the production on this one. You got that little guitar part that plays throughout the song. And just, it's a pretty simple song musically. Like, there's no bridge or anything. It's just versus chorus. But I absolutely love it, and I think it's one of the highlights of the band's '70s output. And I think it's just a beautiful ballad from Brian. So
I was gonna do In My Room, love the harmonies and stuff, but I'm calling a last minute audible and I'm saying fuck it. I'm gonna talk about In My Car. Um, I don't know, man. It's just we mentioned it last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago, and like how it's so infectiously Brian, like him not giving a fuck, just being himself and just writing a catchy song. And I think that holds a lot of weight, especially now, like the fact that Brian had, and I'll say maybe even Let's Go to Heaven in my car too. I'll put that in there a little bit too. Um, like he can write a song like Please Let Me Wonder and In My Room and like all these gorgeous, lush ballads. And then he would just be like, yeah, here's a song about my car and how the engine goes vroom. Like it's something that only he can do. And like I think if anybody else did it, I'd probably call it stupid. But like it's so infectiously him and it's so infectiously fun. And I come back to it a lot more than I probably should. But I've played Let's Go to Heaven in my car with some of my friends in the car. So like both of those just so infectiously Brian. And I always enjoy them strut if only for that. But also the fact that they have awesome chord progressions and awesome guitar parts. So
I was gonna make an in my car joke when you started saying in my room, and then you actually said in my car. So that's why I laughed so hard at that.
My next pick is Do It Again, which I think is just an infectious rocker. It's got such a great groove with that cool drum beat and as well as just a very futuristic, modern kind of production sound to it with the synthesizers and effects. So I think it's just a great collaboration between Brian and Mike. A return to form in many ways, and in my humble opinion, the greatest concert opening song ever written.
So my next choice was originally going to be All I Want to Do from Sunflower, but I'm going to pick something else. This Whole World. First of all, holy shit, the amount of chord changes in this song. Incredible. I love like the rock and guitar. I think Carl sings it really well. And I just think it's like it's one of those like quintessentially Brian lyrics, it's just like, he's thinking about like how there's all these people in the world and when and the bridge is great, when girls get mad and boys and go many times they're just putting on a show. Um and I just think it has a really positive message. But holy shit, the freaking chord changes in that song are incredible.
The eighth song on my list is this kind of a deeper cut that mostly only fans know. Still, I Dream of It, which was from Adult Child, which was never released. I think this is just a really beautiful track. Really connect with the lyrics on this one as well. Still I dream of it, of that happy day when I can say I've fallen in love and it haunts me so like a dream that's somehow linked to all the stars above. I think it's just a great lyric. Really love the studio version that they did with Dick Reynolds arranging it. The four freshman arranger, I believe, did the arrangement on it, gave it kind of that orchestral sound. I really love that a lot. Also love that demo version, that kind of lo-fi recording of Brian just pounding the chords of the piano with his really kind of gravelly voice. I think that's a really moving recording too. So I think this is one of the most overlooked ballads that Brian wrote, but I think it's actually one of the very best as well. I would put it like in my top 10, top 15 Brian songs. I think it's gorgeous. So
going from in my car to Let's Go Away for a While.
my car.
Every word I said is demonstrably true. Um, yeah, I mean there are literally no words I can use to describe this because there's no lyrics to the song. I remember last year I told Nate, I think I texted him like I was just like falling asleep and there's like a faint like blue light in my room and I had Let's Go Away for a While playing in my earbuds as I was like trying to start sleeping and like that was just the perfect way to describe it. It's just gorgeous. It's just gorgeous. That's all I can really say about it. It's just incredible.
That middle part, Riley, I'm sure you know the part where like that little guitar part comes in, like the down, 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 down. That's like the highlight of the song for me. I think it's just beautiful.
Yeah, that and I also like where the song like shifts halfway through.
Yes. Yep.
That's a really good part of the song.
He's also in Baby Driver out of all the movies.
Oh, that I haven't seen that movie in a while. I like that movie a lot.
All right, Nate.
My next pick is another Brian and Mike co-write, and now I'm fast forwarding my chronology to the 80s, and my pick is Going On. I think it's just such a well-written song from the lyrics to the music and the harmonies. And God, Carl's voice sounds amazing. And you've even got a Brian vocal cameo. So to me, Going On is one of their strongest songs of the 80s and probably one of their strongest songs in general, dare I say. So just a wonderful collaboration between Brian and Mike and great production from Bruce.
My next choice is from Love You, I'll Bet He's Nice. Um,
That is a motherfucker.
first of all, Definitely a song that I think everybody can relate to. Especially if you've ever gone through a breakup. Just like, like the longing in the song, kind of like saying like, I know you've moved on and I bet he's like better than me, but I'm still in love with you. I love how you have all three brothers singing on it. Where you have like Dennis opening up the verse and then Brian finishes the verse and then Carl sings the fucking hell out of that bridge. Uh,
Baby.
Yeah, and I love the synth sounds of it, like the do 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 do, like the synth sounds great on it. And then I love the coda, like the you pretty darling, you my
Yeah, pretty done.
It's
just such a beautifully heartfelt song. Really really gorgeous tune.
Well, that was my next one, so I'll pick a different Love You track for my ninth pick. I'm gonna go with "Let's Put Our Hearts Together." Another great ballad from Love You on side two. Really love how it's kind of a duet between Brian and Marilyn. And I think kind of knowing like, kind of the rough state of their, marriage at that time, their relationship really makes this one more moving, like the lyrics, and almost charming in a way. Like Brian with the, I know it may sound funny, but you're the kind of woman who'd make a very sweet wife. It's just such a Brian lyric, but I really love it. And this is another one where like the chords are very interesting as well. This is one where like if you listen to like piano covers of this one, it's really interesting. All of the chord changes. It's a very kind of complex song underneath all the "Love You" production on it. So really like this one a lot, and I think it's another great song from the side two of "Love You."
All right, we're reaching like two of my favorite songs of all time. My favorite song of all time is the one I'll be talking about. I Get Around. I've talked about it to death. I love the guitar and bass parts and piano parts being blended into one awesome rhythm. I think Dennis does actually a pretty good job on the drumming. I don't know if he's on the studio version, but if you've ever heard a live version of him doing it, he does a great job too.
The
I
studio version is Dennis on the drums and Hal Blaine on timbales.
Thank you, Nate. Um, and I love the use of Brian's falsetto. I like Mike's little breakdown vocals. And the song is just makes me feel so nostalgic and so like happy to be as young as I am. In the same way that All Summer Long kind of is, but also in a little bit of a different way. But even though it's my favorite song of all time, I don't think it's my favorite Beach Boys song, if that makes any sense. I don't think it does, but that's how I think of it. It makes sense to me.
My next pick is One Kind of Love from the No Peer Pressure album. And this is a tune that Brian wrote with Scott Bennett, and it's a tribute to Melinda. And this song makes me think about the Love and Mercy movie and how touching that movie was, and how touching it was to see Brian at that stage of his life. And One Kind of Love definitely reflects, I think, those happy feelings he was going through and those like loving feelings he was going through.
All right, last song, guys. One more for each of us.
So for my final track, I'm gonna pick something from that Lucky Old Sun, Good Kind of Love. Very catchy song. I think you could also I could kind of see this song too as kind of being about Melinda a little bit. Um, I really like the chorus. It's very catchy. They have the good kind of love, good kind of love. And that's like the part. It's like just him and her. They're so close together. And I just think it's like a very like heartwarming song, just about like finding the person that like you love, and it's just like it's just like it's wonderful. You get the feeling of euphoria. Um, and I also really like the part where it's like the sun keeps on shining, he rolls around heaven above, like the bridge. And what I also really like about this song is that there is a version on a special edition CD, the CD I have, where Carole King comes in and sings it with Brian. So that's an extra nice touch. Um, so yeah, good kind of love from that Lucky Old Sun is my last choice.
We need a Matt Sings album.
Yeah. For my final pick, I was thinking about doing something from That Lucky Old Sun because I do really love a lot of the songs in there. I was thinking about saying Midnight's Another Day or Southern California because I think those are both really, really moving ballads. But I want to get some representation from Brian Wilson 88, so I'm going to say Melt Away. For me, that's one of the highlights of that record, one of the highlights of Brian's solo catalog. Another one of those songs is just really relatable. If you've ever, been through feelings of depression and just, really struggling, I think the lyrics on that one, and my blues just melt away. It's just a very relatable lyric and a really well written song as well. I really love the chord and the bridge section, like the I won't let you see me suffer. Just a really well written song. So Melt Away from Brian Wilson 88 is my final selection for the night.
There's a lot of songs I probably could have put to this list that just say Brian, speak Brian to you, and that I really love, like Mona. Actually, a lot of the stuff from Love You, anything from Pet Sounds, like In My Car, it's a lot of those songs. But Please Let Me Wonder is I finally accepted it as maybe my favorite Beach Boys song. It's just one I always come back to. I never get bored of it. I'll listen to the different live versions from 65. I love the different mixes, like the stereo mix. I like the original mix. It's just one I always come back to. I love Brian's voice on it. I love the chord changes. I love the subtle guitar lines. It's just such a gorgeous ballad. And I think Mike has incredible lyrics on it. I think he really hit his stride as a lyricist on this record. But Please Let Me Wonder is just one I always come back to. And he, like I said, even though I Get Around is my favorite song of all time, this has to be my favorite Beach Boys song and easily my favorite Brian song.
Mhm.
My 10th pick is what I believe is Brian's final original new single that wasn't like a re-recording or anything. And that is Right Where I Belong from 2019, which was featured in the Long Promised Road movie and accompanying soundtrack. And to me, there's just something so comforting and pleasing about hearing Brian's, who had been through so much pain in his life, so much turmoil, so many ups and downs, for him to sing the lyrics, I'm right where I belong, is so touching, and it's so sweet to see that he went through so much, but ended up in a place in his life where he was comfortable and happy and surrounded by the people that loved him, and he truly was right where he belonged. And at one point in his life, he wasn't made for these times, quote unquote. But then, 50, 60 years later, he said, I'm right where I belong, which is just so beautiful.
Mhm. So thank you everybody for listening to this 53rd episode of Good Timin. I hope you all enjoyed the show. I'm really glad that we could all get together tonight and pay tribute to Brian's life and musical career. And I hope that our discussion can help bring some of you listening some comfort during this difficult time for us Beach Boys fans. So, as always, if you like this podcast and want to hear more, feel free to subscribe or follow wherever you're listening. We greatly appreciate the support as it motivates us to make more episodes in the future. Also, as a reminder, the Good Time In podcast is available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So there's plenty of different places to listen and keep up with the show. So thank you again, everybody, for listening, and we will see you all next time. Bye-bye.